The river ran broad and brown past the red walls, the last light collecting along its ripples like coins in a miser's hand, and the chill that rode the evening breeze smelled of damp stone, old fish, smoke from campfires, and iron. Robb stood at a crenel where moss had fattened and softened the mortar and let his hands rest on the roughness, as if the wall's scratch and grit could anchor his thoughts. The banners along the battlements stirred and fell, as though the whole fortress breathed with him. The Trout of House Tully flickered blue in the failing day. His direwolf's gray silk hung stiffer, heavier, that emblem of a boy who had been a son, a ward, then a lord, and now a king before anyone had had time to teach him how to breathe differently for the crown. Gray wind padded along the walkway at the pace of a shadow. The direwolf preferred the earth, Robb knew. The sense of leaves and soil fresh and layered, stories told honest in the dark air low to the ground. The high walk was a mapless world of wind and stones. Still, the wolf followed him because he was the wolf's and the wolf was his, and when Robb halted at the corner that looked toward the south road, the animal nosed his hand and tasted the salt of his knuckles with a rasp of rough tongue. Robb murmured, not to anyone, then spoke clearly as if the dusk were a court to be kept in order. We will have another night of thin soup and fat talk. And the same men to eat it, said his mother at his shoulder. Catelyn Tully moved with the quiet of someone who had learned early how to be present without being seen. She wore her grief with care, the way a careful lady kept a heavy brooch among the skirts. It weighed her, it bound her, and it promised neither to prevent work nor to let it be forgotten. Edmure says the Lannisters' ravens came at sunset, she added. Seaguard has a guest, several in mail and silk both. They bring the sun with them, the message said, as if the Lord of Seaguard has grown a poet in his old years. Robb rolled his shoulders until the leather of the doublet answered. And do they bring spears? That is a question to ask in a proper room with a flagon between you, Catelyn said. But I would counsel you to ask before the flagon is half drunk. Then I have only enough time for the other half of your counsel, he said, and she turned her head so he could see the ghost of a smile. Below them the courtyards promised the small mercies of routine. A saddle squeaked, a cook shouted, a pike clattered against a stone lip, a stable cat made a sound like prayer. Robb looked away from the river's muddied light and toward the gatehouse where the day's dust hung in the squared air like cobwebs. He thought of his father and the way his father had looked out upon Winterfell's first snow each year, with a hunger, a stern mouth made softer by memory, as if the season were a truce he had signed long ago with the land. There was a way to stand that said nothing about the weight of what had been carried, only the steadiness of the back. Robb tried to find it in his bones. A guest, he said quietly, to the evening as if it were another bannerman to be given instruction. We'll give them good bread and clean knives, and hear what sort of sun they bring. Catelyn touched the back of his hand where it lay on the weathered stone. They are Dornish, she said, as if one spoke the word within a sept, in the voice used for gods and grief. Doran Martell's kin, it seems. We must be careful. We are careful, Robb said, because that is what kings said when they meant they would try. He watched Grey Wind's ears move to the sounds even he could not name. A scuff on the stair, a swallow at its nest, the river's change of mind. The wolf's muscles folded and unfolded beneath his gray pelt with the grace of a river bending around a stone, but his eyes were winter clear. When Robb turned, those eyes went with him, and together they descended into the fortress that had, for a time, felt like a borrowed coat, too snug at the shoulders, strange-smelling, and had become, by increments, a garment lined by use. Riverrun's great hall was a place of surge and retreat, of voices and the clink of metal and the hush that followed blunt words. The tables were set with what had been saved and what had been taken. Loaves dark as riverbanks, salted fish with the shine not yet dulled on their skin, onions that stung, a cheese that fought back beneath the knife. The fire ran low, prudent as a steward counting coins at week's end. Men's laughter cracked against the stone and split into echoes that recombined to make them sound more numerous, more confident than they were. Great John Umber held forth at one corner with a crash of hand on plank and a face flushed with ale and the pleasure of his own fierceness. The Karstarks sat grim and straight-backed, as if each had swallowed a sword and it had nailed them to their chairs. Mormont women took meat in a way that made the men around them decide to drink instead. Roose Bolton sat pale and the color of wet paper at the far end, eyes wandering and resting like flies, his presence a soft frost on the necks of those who noticed him. Robb entered with gray wind pacing at his hip, and a hush like a drawn breath moved through the hall, mild as sleep in some places, sharp as fear in others. He took the high seat not as a ceremonial act but with the economy of a man who knew where to put his body so that the talk would begin and the food would be eaten. Caitlin took the place to his right with hands folded and eyes that missed nothing and took insult at nothing that did not require it. The herald did his part. He named a king and a hall and the business of the night. He named too the coming of Lord Jason Mallister's ravens and set the hall's appetite for tidings. When they were done with the first courses, and the talk had warmed itself on the slow fire of ordinary complaint, Robb nodded once to the herald, and the man raised his voice to announce the arrival of Lord Mallister's guests. "They are at Seaguard now, your grace," the herald said, "but their messenger rides like a man with a held breath. He will be here by moonrise. Then pipe him to supper and don't make him speak with dust in his teeth," Robb said. "When he eats, let him eat. When he speaks, let him be heard." Caitlin's eyes went to him. "You have learned the art of making time behave," she said. He allowed himself a small smile. "I have learned that men say foolish things when they are hungry. And when they are drunk," she said. "And when they are certain," he added, as if they were working a braid together, and she inclined her head as if to note the neatness of the plate. The messenger's horse came to the inner yard steaming like hoarfrost breath. Men made a path for him the way they did for bad weather. He was brought the length of the hall with a bowl of broth in one hand and his hat in the other. He put one down only to take up the other. He bent his knee in a clatter of haste, and Robb told him to rise and drink. The man obeyed in great swallows that made his throat work like a frog's, and when he spoke, his voice came thick with gratitude and a long ride's ruin. "My lord, your grace," he said. He was older than his haste made him look. His hair had gone gray at the temples without troubling with any pattern. "Lord Jason bids me say, Seaguard's bells did ring at sunset but not for alarm. We have hosts, your grace, from far south. Silken colors as strange as parrots and men with hair like burnt chestnuts and eyes that are quick and soft at once. They come beneath the red sun and spear. They come from Sunspear with a princess at their head." The word princess moved through the hall with a living quiet. It wasn't that men ceased to talk. It was that they had been speaking a language in which they were fluent, war, wound, weather. And now a new tongue had entered the room in their own mouths. "Which princess?" Caitlin asked, not to cut Robb but to add a precision. "Arianne," the man said, stumbling slightly over the taste of the name, "not born to the vowels of the south. Daughter to Prince Doran, and sister to Prince Quentin and princess to Prince Tristane. She comes with 20 spears for her honor and 2 ships at anchor and letters heavy with seal wax, and she says she comes to parley in her father's name." Roose Bolton, who had the way of seeming absent even when he stirred his cup, lifted his eyes. "Dorne keeps its own counsel," he observed, voice low enough that it could have been a thought decided aloud, "and keeps it long. Time wrings its hands in Sunspear, I am told," Great John Umber said, with a laugh like someone chopping wood, "quiet as their watered wine. What do they want, to be sure?" "They want what we want," someone else said, and a murmur rose. Tywin Lannister named as a wish one made by spitting, Elia Martell's name rising like a stone thrown in a still pond. Mace Tyrell's appetite raised as a cause and symptom both. Caitlyn's mouth went tight at the corners. Robb lifted his hand and the hall turned its faces toward him like flowers. "Dorne wants to be treated with the honor it is owed," he said. "We will meet them with the honor we owe ourselves. Lord Karstark, my lord of Bolton, Great John, eat your meat and swallow only half your words for an hour more. Then come to the solar." And because he said it in a voice that had grown unafraid to be obeyed, they did as he asked. He left the hall with gray wind flowing around him like cold smoke. Caitlin walked beside him, head slightly bowed, as if listening to a music inside her that he could not hear. The solar smelled of old parchment and the oil that had soaked into the table like a stain of lineage. The candles were newly trimmed. Their light was a small, stubborn country that the night could not annex. He took a seat where his father had once spread reports of harvest and of the weather. Catelyn took the same chair in which she had once argued for patience with a man's life at the end of patience. She would not have come without her father's consent, Catelyn said, and he would not have sent her unless he had decided to stop waiting. Robb leaned back and let the chair creak, a sound that was not complaint so much as memory announced. Waiting for what? For the game to be more obvious. For the players to declare themselves entirely. For those who killed his sister's children to show whether their victory had made them believe in their own invulnerability. For the Tyrells to declare their intentions with flowers so many and so thick that the whole of King's Landing sneezed. For the river to clear after mud rains. She let out a breath that made the candle flame bend and quicken. For you to become real. He looked at his hands, long-fingered like his father's, but paler for the lack of the Winterfell sun, and rubbed a thumb along the bone at the base of his fingers until he felt the sharpness of youth still set in him like a spur. I have been real to men who have died for me, he said. But I suppose that is not what you mean. I mean that you were a boy who stood up and put a crown upon his head and called it a name, Catelyn said. Now you are a man whose victories and errors and negotiations make that crown sit easier. Now you are not a danger only to yourself. He smiled without pleasure. I am a danger to others, then? You are a force other men must account for in their sleep, she said, and there was pride and there was fear in it, equal and hard in her voice. If Dorne has decided to speak to you, it is because they have decided the thing you represent is no longer a rumor whispered to keep children in bed. You are something that can be used or joined or broken. He rubbed his thumb along the bone again. Then let us let them use us. Let us let them join us. Let us not let them break us. Be wary of those who believe they can keep their hands clean in a dirty world, Catelyn said softly. The Dornish are very proud of their cleanliness. He laughed then, the sound startling even him, and she smiled for real, and the candlelight made moving islands of gold in her eyes. The messenger's second bowl had been taken away. He had been given a heel of bread the size of a child's arm, and he had eaten it with the attention one gave statecraft. He was brought to the solar and chose, at a nod, to stand rather than sit. How many days from Seaguard to Riverrun if they are cautious? Robb asked him. For if they let themselves be surrounded by caution, the man said. 2 and some hours if their caution is only a cloak and not a shield.
Robb's mouth bent.
Do they seem more cloak or shield? They seem to me like women who would show you the edge of a knife and smile, the man said, then flushed as if at his own boldness. And I ask your grace to forgive me. I am a horse. I ride. Great John Umber snorted. Ah, he's a poet as well. Let the Dornish be daggers with smiles. I prefer a cudgel with a scowl. Easier to know where you are with such a thing. Roose Bolton had arranged his hands on the table with the precision of a man who cared what his own fingers said. We should know, your grace, whether this princess is bait or a pledge, or both. To bring a daughter is to promise a certain sincerity. But to bring a daughter is also to serve her to wolves. Grey Wind lifted his head at the word and gazed at Bolton for a long beat that made the room tilt for those who noticed. She leads 20 spears, not 2, Catelyn said, and Seaguard is no kennel. Jason Mallister is a careful host. He does not keep twins, Roose said, and if there was a jest in it, it didn't show anywhere in the pale plane of his face. Nor will he keep Dornish long upon his benches, Robb said. We will meet them halfway down the road tomorrow, not with a host. With myself and a guard that is appropriate to the meeting of a king and a princess. How appropriate is a guard? Great John rumbled, as if taste-testing a word for its chew. Appropriate is a shield that can turn away insult without throwing it back too hard, Robb said. Appropriate is spears that look like spears and are not knives hidden in sleeves. Appropriate is not an army. If we meet them with everything we own, we are supplicants. and I do not beg from a prince of Dorne or a lord of the twins. Not yet and not here. The great John thumped a hand. So said, he grinned. I'll go with you and I'll bring a voice and a sword, and I'll keep them from deciding the one is the other. You will stay, Robb said, with a gentleness that was of Winterfell, not of battle. I need your noise here. Men hear it and feel themselves brave. Let Karstark's men be my guard. Let Meage Mormont send me one of her daughters with a spear. Let Ser Brynden come as my uncle, not as my fish. And me? Roose Bolton asked and looked nowhere in particular. You will stay, Robb said, and he smiled in a way that made it small and polite. I have need of quiet men to listen to quiet things. Bolton's eyes dropped to the table as if it had told him a joke only he could hear. As you wish. Catelyn did not speak in that moment. Later, when the room had been left to the dust and the chairs and the candle stubs, she would touch Robb's wrist as if to feel a fever. Now she only breathed. The next morning dawned with a sky like wet wool, low and slow to move. They went south upon the Red Fork Road with the sort of pace that told as much as banners. Robb rode at the head in a leather breastplate burnished until it could consider calling itself polished, and wore no cloak though the air begged for one. He had learned that the imagination of others would dress him in furs or in crowns. He preferred to give them less cloth with which to sow their fears. Gray wind slid along under the horses' noses, unbothered by their snorts, a thing too close to the earth to care for their nerves. Ser Brynden Tully rode at his left, dark-eyed and sardonic in his silence. He wore the black fish on his shield as if the whole composition of his person had been born for it. At Robb's right rode Dacy Mormont with a spear that had seen better meat and worse men. Behind them rode a dozen Karstark men with the stiffness of men who had been told to behave, and behind them still a scatter of Northmen who had been picked as much for their faces as for their arms. Honest-looking, not too clever, not too stupid, meat and bone from their villages that would read as what they were. The land had been trampled and burned and replanted with wildness and the thin spines of stubborn wheat. They passed hedgerows that held pockets of sky in their leaves, then let the light spill in tiny portions upon the ruts. They passed a ruined mill whose wheel had stopped as if mid-sentence and never found the word again. They passed a sullen farm dog that would not bark, and a woman who recognized the king by the suddenness with which his companions looked at her, and who made a shape with her hands that could have been blessing, or could have been warding. They met the Dornish party at noon. It was as if the weather broke open upon them. The world had been brown and green and the wet wool of sky. Now here came color as if a painter had shaken out his robe over the road. A standard with a red sun pierced by a spear went ahead, its silk like hot breath. Men in sleeveless mail showed arms bronzed by other suns. The leather at their belts had been oiled with scents alien to this damp. Their faces were made beautiful by honing and heat. Their horses wore caparisons dyed unashamedly. Their saddles were too carefully made to be unremarked. And at their head rode the woman who set the weather. She wore her hair like a declaration, thick and dark and too alive to be contained by any strictness, braided so that it ved and yet not entirely. Her gown was riding gear made for purpose. It followed the lines of her body, not as if her body were a place to be displayed, but as if it were a place where she lived and worked and made decisions. The red sun shone on her breast. She sat a mare the color of a promise kept, and the mare moved as if she were flattered by her rider. Between them, in the air that separated his world from hers, the difference of sky and sand showed itself. He felt the river wind cling to his skin. She looked as if the wind chose to run along her and be improved by it. "Your Grace," she said when they had halted with all the care of men who wished their horses to respect their words. She did not dismount. She did not offer her hand as if she were at a tourney. She simply inclined her head as if it had never learned to be lowered. "Princess," Robb said. He also stayed in the saddle. He found that the sun looked better reflected off her bridle than it did upon her brow, and so he looked there and then met her eyes. They were brown like rich earth. They saw without flicker. "You have that which is ours," she said. "A war with our enemies in the west. We have something that may be yours. Beers. The south road open. An honest appetite for justice. Have you words from your father?" She brought forth a leather tube with seal wax that had traveled with dignity. She did not toss it. She did not make it a relic. She handed it to Ser Brynden as if to say, "There, take that. Now keep your eyes where they should be." Robb nodded to Daisy, and Daisy gave a word to a boy behind them, and the boy took the tube to run it up to Riverrun, where a maester would crack it like an egg in a warm place and breakfast would be served. "We talk better when we are not sitting on our hindquarters," Princess Arianne said, and slid down from the saddle with the grace of a weaver. She handed her reins to a man with hair the color of a crow's wing and a scar that had selected his cheek as a home. The man took the reins and the measure of the men around him at once. Robb put his feet to the earth. Gray wind came up and put his cold nose into the dusk of the mare's foreleg and breathed in. The mare snorted but did not shift her weight, which told Robb something about the princess's life among animals that could be made to listen. "You bring a wolf to a parley," Arianne observed. "He came himself," Robb said. "I can respect a creature who keeps his own counsel," she replied. There was a shade where the hedge had grown overboiled and turned into a living tunnel. There a small patch of grass, the first that grew thick that day, offered itself. They went into it together, not alone. No one was that foolish, but with their chosen shadows. Brynden Tully for Robb, a lean Dornish knight with a blade that had seen sand, not mud, for Arianne. Daisy Mormont leaned on her spear and watched the Dornish watch her. The wind, nursing a sting at its throat, came and went as if uncertain whose court it was in. "My father sends what a father can send," Arianne said, letting her hand rest upon the hilt of a dagger, not as if she would draw it, but as if it were a thing that completed her. "And what is that?" "Me," she said, and Robb felt the weight of that honesty more than he would have felt 100 spears laid at his feet. "He offers my hand. He offers that name. He offers the southern road clear of our hostility, and the promise of men who will fight not to be included in songs, but because they wish to breathe in a world where certain men are dead." "And what does he ask?" She smiled, and it was not warm. It was direct. "He asks what any father of a murdered woman asks. Justice. Not the shape of a court's phrases. The shape of a man falling when the blade goes in. He asks to see the house that ordered the deaths of Elia and her children brought low. Not for piety, for satisfaction. He asks for an accounting in which the line of that house pays until it learns to count differently. That house is the crown's right hand now," Robb said. "Though one could argue about the rightness." "I am arguing about the rightness now," she said. "We can argue together. I prefer not to argue alone in a house that smells of other men's dinners." "Your father sends you with a marriage and with a plan for the West," Robb said. "What of the capital? What of the men who wear flowers above their armor like a letter from their mother? What of the lion who lies at the heart of that tangle? It is one thing to pull apart a braid from the end. It is another to take a knife to it from the center. You have a way with cloth," she said, and glanced at his hands. And he found himself flushing because he had taken to mending his own glove the night before and the stitches still marked him. "Princess Marjorie sits the queen's seat as if it were made for her. She smiles. She collects ladies. She performs piety with the thoroughness of a penance imposed. Her cause brings small folk to her door with petitions. If I were inclined to spite her, I would do it with fire. But I am not stupid. I do not suggest you march upon a linen cupboard with torches. The Tyrells are not our first obstacle." "Who is?" "The man who believed the murder of children a political solution," she said. "He is a man with slow blood and quick decisions. Your father died because that man values expedience over oaths and meals his father taught him to eat. Your men have died because he believed your grief could be used like a planked bridge. I say his heart can still pump fear. And I say there are names to be spoken in Dorne with tears dried at last if his head is displayed above the walls he protected with other people's lives." "You speak plainly," Robb said. "I am a princess," she said. "I was raised by a man who does not believe women should be punished for speaking in the language of men. My aim is not to be liked by men who cannot make me safer. And forgive me, you are Yoon. But you sit a horse as if you are not a boy. Shall we speak as what we are?" He looked at her long enough to feel the look grow into thought and then into choice. "We shall. Then let us arrange the manner of our truth," she said. "You promised a river lord a marriage. I am aware of the shape of the insult that could be made of unmade vows. Do not lie to me. I know you promised to wed a daughter of the twins to pass your men over their bridges. I know you took a different road later, but the promise remains as a scar even if you have covered it with bandage and ointment. If you wed me, you will have insulted that house beyond the prick they have already suffered." "It is true," Robb said. "There were nights when the shape of the twins rose in him like a nightmare with architecture. I told Lord Walder Frey what he wished to hear in order to move an army. I did not marry his daughter. I had not married anyone. Do not attempt to soften the meat by chewing it twice," she said. "They have been insulted because their pride is a tapestry too eager to be hung. It is not my task to redeem your honor with them. If you wed me, you wed their enmity. But you will wed, too, a house that cares not for the Freys and does not attend their feasts, and whose anger will be directed at the lion, even if it sees you as a boy who knows the shape of promise like a sword knows a sheath. We will compensate the Freys with meat and something to swear upon. That is your part. Mine is to fill my father's promise with my own body." There were men at his back and men at her back, and the hedge had ears. Robb felt the steady, cool touch of gray winds flank against his knee and found that the wolf's calm was the calm of a star in a sky full of clouds. He thought of the shape of the Red Fork in summer, how it sought its own depth and found its own corners. He thought of Winterfell's godswood and the still center of the pool. He thought of his sister's laughter on the ramparts. He thought of a sword with a name and of the feel of his father's hand upon his shoulder. He thought of the bed he had slept in the night before. He made himself think of Lord Walder's face, like a door that had been carved upon a rotten tree. He made himself think of a hall full of meat and music and the wrong smell at the wrong time. Then he said, "I will wed you." It was not a thing he would have said the day before. It was not a thing he would have said had the river been higher, or had gray wind nosed his hand at a different moment. It was not a thing he would have said if the woman before him had had a different voice. But the world is made of particulars and their timings. He felt the decision grip him from inside. He had been made king by acclamation and blood and the fact of other men's choices. This he did with his own mouth. Arianne lifted her chin the smallest degree, as if tasting the air to assess the truth of it. "You will not call it a bargain in which you are the noble party and I the grateful one," she said. "We wed for war. We wed for the dead. We wed because the South has known too many summers and your North too many winters. We wed to make the weather uncertain for those in the middle." "Yes," he said. "And you understand what it brings to your North," she said. "Dorne is not a place that forgets insult. We hold grudges as if they were water in a jar. If your men insult our women, I will make you pay as if you had laid hands yourself. Know it now, and we are not a place that bows easily. Your grace will be said in our tents with straight backs and narrow eyes. We will not call your gods ours, and we will not pretend your cold stories are the only ones worth the telling. We will keep our customs near our skin, and you will not ask us to undress in front of this river." He felt the slow smile come out of him like breath. "I accept your jars, and I would not steal your water. If your men keep their knives where I can see them, I will not ask them to eat what they will not swallow. But I will ask this, that when a spear must be pointed, it point with the rest of ours." "Good," she said. She looked past him at the men who stood as if the hedge around them had been given the shape of a wall by this conversation. "We will take a cup of wine now, and then we will ride. If I am to marry in your hall, let me smell it first and decide I can survive the scent." He realized he had wanted to ask, "What do you think of me?" But the form in which she lived made that sort of question sound like a boy asking a hawk whether it liked the glove. Instead, he gestured to Ser Brynden, who had a way of making a jug appear without ever having been seen to move, and soon they drank from the same cup, not as a right, only a sense. She drank, her throat working quickly, the line of it strong, and when she handed the cup back, her fingers brushed his and there was a piece of ash upon one of her knuckles. as if she had touched a brazier that morning and not bothered to wash it off for anything less than a wedding. To justice, then, she said, and did not say to love. They rode to Riverrun. The Dornish entered as if they did not intend to measure themselves against anything but the need to be efficient. The men of the hall looked at them as if the South had been folded up and slid under the door. Jason Mallister came the following day with stories about how the Dornish had admired his towers and how his towers had admired them back. He was a gentleman to the end and had made himself hospitable even to the way their knives looked when they cut his meat. Catelyn and Arianne met in a small chamber whose window looked upon the river. The light there was always a form of patience. Catelyn had chosen the room because it had soothed her once when she had been a young woman pacing its width and thinking of leaving. She found that it had remembered how to do so. The Dornish princess entered with 2 women and a knight who stood outside the threshold. LD and became a piece of furniture without ever touching wall or floor. Arianne dismissed one woman with a flick, kept the other for her hair, and then sent even that one away. "You are the mother," Arianne said. "I can smell it." Catelyn laughed before she had meant to. It came out like a bird startled from water. "And you are your father's daring," she said. "I can see it." "His daring is to sit very long and watch other men pluck fruit early and then get stomachaches," Arianne said, and came to the window and took the river in with a look that did not try to name it to itself. "But he has sent me now, so perhaps the fruit is almost fallen and even his gout cannot insist we wait." "You will be married here," Catelyn said. "If you are to be married quickly, or you will be betrothed and then married under other trees. Our gods see through the eyes of a carved face in a wood. Our God who gives bread demands a priest. Your sand gives different counsel, I think, and the gods are less interested in watching. How much cloth do you need to make a wedding out of it?" "This much," Arianne said, and put her hands close together, then spread them slowly. "And then this much more when the men have had their fill. I will have it be proper enough for letters to lie about. I will have it be quick enough that letters cannot interfere." Catelyn felt relief, actual particular relief, a face she had not expected to see. "He will be grateful to you," she said, "though he may not know how to say it without seeming too young. He is young." "He is a king," Arianne said, and then softened as if a corner of her mouth had been convinced by a different argument. "He is young. He looks at me as if he knows the cost of a cut and has not forgotten it between steps. I have met men who only remember their own blood when they get it on their shoes. He is not one of them. Does he truly love his wolf?" Catelyn breathed again that startled sound. "I think the wolf kept something from falling out of him when his father died," she said, "as if the animal became a seam." "Then I will not ask for it to be left out of the room," Arianne said, and turned from the window with the sun making a small warming upon her cheek. "I do not keep pets, but I like an honest animal." They discussed stones and words and the shape of a table. They spoke of what would be served to those who did not drink northern ale and to those who drank nothing else. They spoke of the number of men who would need to remain in the yard so that, if any insult came with uninvited knives, it could be contained without the whole halls becoming a map of blood. Catelyn did not speak of worry as if it were a separate person. She let it be part of her conversation the way the river's sound was part of the room. Arianne used a small piece of charcoal she had not known she had carried in her belt to make a mark upon the sill. A simple stroke, and when Catelyn glanced at it, the princess said, "I like to leave pieces of myself in rooms, not to be remembered, to be present, by force of stain." "You are very sure of your world," Catelyn murmured, and the other woman looked not offended but amused by the observation. "My world is always trying to make itself on my skin," Arianne said. "If I do not help it, someone else will." Robb and Arianne stood before the heart tree 2 days later. The red leaves stirred with that wind that only moved when the god wished to sigh. The grooves in the face filled with shadow so that the carved eyes looked drenched with old weather. They had made the day by order rather than by calendar. The sort of blue in the sky that made men drink with less caution and women decide their children could run for an hour more. The yard had been made plain. There were no garlands, no pretty things to catch the light and predict a harvest. There was a table where the witnesses set their cups down. There was a bench upon which two old women sat with their hands folded and their chins lifted, as if to say they had seen finer weddings but would make no remark that would harm this one, for fear of angering the god. A septon said what the faith required in another chamber later, so that no man could say there had not been enough words said to bless even men who demanded too many words as a habit. But here, under the red leaves and before a face that had seen other things, the words were simpler. Arion took a strand of his hair, and he took a strand of hers, and they knotted them together with a bit of silk cut from the hem of her garment. And when he apologized for the theft, she said, "If my skirt cannot spare an inch for justice, it is worse cloth than I knew." They knelt a moment not as people praying, but as people looking at the same thing from the same level. The grain of the wood upon which the god's face had been carved, the small insect moving across the grain, the way the shadow fell there. Robb liked the smell of the place the way he had always liked it. He thought she was learning to tolerate it. His hand shook at the end the way a fever shakes a man in the hour before it breaks. He hid it by gripping the silk too tight. She saw it anyway because she was looking, and her face did not move except for a minute, easing at the corner of her mouth, which said, "Yes, I know what a hand does when the inside of a man becomes air." They drank from the same cup, not for romance but because this was how people remembered, and when she handed it to him after that last sip, her fingers smelled of something like saffron, something like dried orange peel rubbed between fingers. He wanted wildly not to forget that smell. Later there was meat in the hall and music that was not the sort that made men wish to hold knives. There was laughter that had no blood in its teeth. There was a place near the hearth where the warmth thickened and turned to sleep for any who sat in it. There was a place near the door where men pretended not to be watching the Lord Jason Mallister spoke of a storm he had watched come in upon Seaguard from the west, and how it had made his birds silent a half-hour before any man had seen a cloud. Meege Mormont congratulated the princess with a clap upon the shoulder that would have felled a lesser woman, and Arion returned the courtesy with a joke whose joy ran upon strong legs. The Karstarks sat with a watchfulness that had hardened to sorrow. Those men whose lord was confined and whose rage had been apprenticed to their silence. Roose Bolton sat with eyes dull as if polished to the wrong shine. He smiled once, and it was like a curtain lifting in a theater's unlit corner. Walder Frey did not come, but he sent a letter that was like a hand that had been washed too often and never dried. It was read in a small room with a small fire, and when it had been read, it was placed upon the table, and no one put a cup upon it as if it were a coaster. Edmure came in after that, flushed with a good supper upon a day that had warmed him like a hearth. And then he saw the faces around the letter and felt his own chest build around a future he had not ordered. "I will wed Roslin," he said, "if it stops the bridge from falling beneath our feet. If it makes any of this armor better fitted. I will do it, sister, nephew. I will do it because I have eaten well and laughed too much tonight to have it stolen on the road home." Caitlin looked at him with the sort of love that made her mouth look young and old at once. "You will not be punished for generosity," she said, "but you may be punished anyway." He lifted the corners of his hands as if to show them empty. "Then let us choose to be generous even when we are punished." Robb clasped his uncle's forearm. "I am asking this of you like a man asking for a loan, not like a king issuing a command. I cannot make Walder honest. I can make your sacrifice precious." "Make it practical," Edmure said, with a grin that, for a heartbeat, made him look like the boy who had tried to put a trout in his sister's bed and ended up with a broken chamber pot. "Make it stop a charge." They sent 3 letters to the twins. One went in the mouth of a raven with feathers the color of old iron. The second went with a man who had once worked in Lord Frey's kitchens and who knew the names of his bastard sons better than he knew his own. The third was carried by a woman with hair as pale as flax and a steadiness that made Robb think she would have made a good tree in a godswood. Letters could not save a thing from falling, but they could act like ropes thrown from different windows. On the 3rd night after the wedding, when the meat had been eaten and the Dornish had learned which fires made smoke in strange colors and which beers were less likely to put a man on his face, a man came to Riverrun who had a voice that made walls want to lean to hear him better. He was not tall, but he moved as if height were a choice, not a fact, and he had the sort of smile that had been shaped by the need to persuade and to kill. He wore a garment that caught light with a petulant insistence, and one of his boots had been cut and resewn to allow for a limp that he chose to ignore. "Oberyn Martell," he announced, to save anyone else the trouble and also to claim the air before any other voice could reshape it. He bowed to the queen as if he had invented the idea of bowing and now remembered he had made it for this moment alone. "Sister, nephew-in-law, Northern King, I bring the South with me and also my appetite." Arianne went to him and put her hands on his shoulders and kissed both his cheeks with the calculation of a woman who knew the worth of being seen to love her own. "Uncle," she said, "you took your time, and you took your opportunity," he said, pleased. "I am always delayed by pleasure. Set me a better example and I shall follow it." Catelyn inclined her head, the gesture she reserved for men who needed to be acknowledged as men, and then gently shown the limits of their danger. "We are honored," she said. "Riverrun offers wine and gossip. Choose wisely among them." Oberyn smiled, his teeth like clever stones. "I will take both and make a sword out of them," he said. "But first..." He looked at Robb as if he were a horse being weighed for purchase and service and war. "Do you know what you have done?" "Married a woman," Robb said. "Married a house that will make your enemies remember their gods for a change," Oberyn said, with relish. "I approve. I approve, oh I approve. And I have brought with me men who enjoy reminding others of their gods. Men of the sands, your grace, who find your river cold but your wine acceptable. Men who will cut an ankle tendon in a crowd and then drink quietly while they wait for the rest of the beast to fall." Arianne arched an eyebrow. "Your poetry grows indecorous." "It grows accurate," he said. "I have come because our father..." He made the word into a jest with a tilt of his head. "My brother sends me when he wishes to be decisive while pretending he does not. He would like our name to be said in the same sentence as avenge and marry and arm. He has decided to place his weight upon your side of the balance. He attempts to make the scale polite. I have come to throw coins with the force that breaks elegance." "Where do you wish me?" "In every place I cannot be at once," Robb said, equal pleasure and equal caution in his voice. "But first at my table. Stories before strategies. I have learned that men who tell their best stories tell many truths without meaning to." "Ah!" Oberyn laughed, turned the sound on its side, and then let it out through his teeth. "You have been educated by necessity. It has made a man of you. Very well. Bring me a cup and an old man to insult and the youngest singer you can find who thinks he understands love without dying of it, because he will make a very good witness for later when I require someone to confirm that I told him bet." And he did not listen. Grey Wind had put his chin upon his paws by the hearth, as if to decide that the fire would tell him a story if he stared at it long enough. Oberyn knelt by the animal and looked into his amber eyes and did not extend a hand. He nodded to him as if to a prince. The wolf accepted the courtesy. It was, Robb thought, as close to a benediction as a certain sort of creature could give. War councils that included Oberyn Martell had a different weather. He drew maps in the air with his finger as if he were slicing pastries. He named men and their mistakes with a relish that made those present hope very much not to be included in the litany. He understood that the road through the Boneway and the Prince's Pass were not simply doors but stories with knives hidden in the bindings. He spoke the names of minor mountain lords as if he counted their teeth at night. He insisted that intelligence mattered more than numbers, and then insisted that numbers were important if one meant to live. "Dorne will bring men," he said. "Slow for some because that is their nature, quick for others because someone has told them there will be songs. We will not march in one river, sweeping and brilliant. We will trickle through cracks. Through the dry riverbeds the spring fills, and we will be many small bites before we are a torn throat. The lion will be chewing elsewhere. The roses will be making garlands. And we..." He gestured with 2 fingers in a flick that could have drawn a blade from a throat. "We will be underfoot and everywhere, and when the heavy foot comes down it will find knives." Roose Bolton moved his eyes like a man turning stones in a stream. "It is a brave plan," he said. "No," Oberyn replied, not unkindly. "It is a sensible plan dressed provocatively. I leave bravery to poets and night work to men who know how to be silent even when they feel very strongly. What say you, North?" We say that snow covers tracks and a man's breath gives him away. Brynden Tully answered for them, the corner of his mouth turned down with the pleasure of respect. We say that you desert men think mud is only mud. It can be used. Teach me, Oberyn said, and he meant it. We will make the mud taste of south and the sand smell of wet wool. It will make them ill. Arianne watched and learned and then took a small, sharp place at the table. She asked about the carrying of ravens in weather that had decided to distrust birds. She asked about the coin to be paid out to widows so that men would not feel war's tithe as hunger and resentment. She asked whether a groom's brother in one of the small villages along the Green Fork would be more likely to listen to a woman or a man when told to hide his harvest from riders whose boots sound like clatter and whose laughter sounds like grief. She asked about the faces of those small lords whose allegiance had drifted like foam and where to nail their loyalties so that they did not float away. Robb watched her hand move, the ink drying where she stabbed the quill too hard in her impatience, and felt something settle in him that had nothing at all to do with desire and everything to do with the sensation of having found a stone in the river that did not roll underfoot. He lay that night with his new wife in a bed that had been slept in by men who had only known the cold edge of responsibility and wept into their pillows in secret for it. He did not weep. He did not take more of her than the night should be asked to carry from one room to another. They spoke in the dark as people speak when they know they will require each other's faith later, when the words of men have gone thin and stink of sarcasm. I will not love you because you are a king, she said, and I will not hate you because you are a boy. I will love you when you do something that earns it, and hate you when you do something that deserves it. You will likely have both from me in a week. Plan accordingly. I will not love you because you are beautiful, he said, feeling his mouth shape the words without apology. I will love you when your mind gives me something it did not intend to, and I will hate you when you make me see something about myself I would rather not. I will work to deserve the first and survive the second. Survival is hardly my concern, she said very quietly, and he knew that she was thinking of a certain tower in the Red Keep and a door that had been cut with a knife meant for a child. He reached across the bed and found her hand and held it the way one ties a boat to a post in a sudden wind. They lay that way until the candles died with small sighs, and the river made the soft speech it made when it wished to make men sleep. In the days that followed, the weather changed, as if it had been waiting on their marriage to decide its next trick. The river swelled slightly, then drew back, then surged again, a slow animal that did not like the shape of its own bed. Ravens came and went as if they had little time for sentiment. One carried a ribbon tied to its leg that had belonged to a fry girl. The ribbon smelled faintly of pears and vanity. Edmure's wedding was set upon a day that would not be as pleasing as Robb's but would be as public. A promise made in the open where men are forced to keep their faces. Men gathered in the yard to watch the Dornish practice. Arianne took a spear in her hand the way a singer takes a song. She gave it a shape and then let it speak with her arm. Men who did not think they could be surprised stood with their tongues behind their teeth and tasted a new respect. Grey Wind watched and then turned his head to where the river ran, as if the water had told him something important about spears. A letter came from White Harbor with a seal that had been smudged before it was set. Wyman Manderly's words were full of food and sunk gold and a promise to build ships on a belly and stand men in them who would sing for their supper and fight for their future. Robb held that letter like a piece of bread he intended to share very carefully. He considered a map and where ships might best sting a coast. He thought of the distance between White Harbor and Sunspear and wondered at a world where men built boats as answers to other men's appetites. A raven came from the twins as well, and the seal was a crude thing that had become brittle with too much wax. It smelled of wilted flowers and the grease that accumulates upon old door hinges. Walder Frey's words were sweet until they were not. He wrote of insult and of friendship offered like a poisoned figure. He wrote of a king too grand to remember a bridge, and he wrote of a bride he would offer up as if he had not first been spurned. Edmure read and smiled and said, "Yes," with the patience of a man who would make a good father because he could bear a child's tantrum without relenting where it mattered. Catelyn read and said nothing and pressed her hand to her lips, and then to her heart, and then to her lips again. Oberyn Martell read and laughed until the walls shook and then stopped abruptly and said, "We will count his knives for him." With a look that was more threat than head count, Roose Bolton offered counsel with a softness that made all of them wish to scrub their faces. "We must not be seen to approach with hubris," he said. "We must not arrive with insult tucked into our cloaks. If we must bring men, let them be men who can dance and not men who can only stab." Great John Umber wanted to bring a host. Brynden Tully wanted to bring sense. Arianne wanted to bring the sort of eyes that catch what men hope to keep quiet. Robb wanted to bring his wife and his uncle and a few dozen men whose faces did not lie. At night, before the last meeting and the setting of the day for the crossing to the twins, Robb went to the Godswood. The sky was a hard clear, the stars like salt thrown upon black bread. Gray Wind lay with his head between his paws and made the smallest noise at the back of his throat. Not growl, not whine. A knitting sound. Robb knelt before the heart tree as he had done as a boy when his father had schooled him in justice and the work of men who carry names. The leaves made a slow sound like hand upon silk. He did not pray for victory. He prayed for sense. He prayed for a measure of fear sufficient to keep him cautious and insufficient to make him a coward. He prayed that when he looked at his wife, he would remember not only the shape of her face in candlelight but the way her mind had moved across the map like competent weather. He asked the old god to remind him what honesty felt like when he needed to say no to a man he loved and yes to a man he did not trust. He felt foolish for asking. He felt less foolish when the leaves moved in a breath that could have been his own. When he rose, the world gave him a moment that was nothing but a moment. The sound of a night bird whose call made the hair at the nape of his neck lift as if it were remembering winter. The sight of a moth that had allowed itself to be hypnotized by candlelight. The smell of horse and iron and the small rot of leaves. He thought, "I am alive, and the world is full of living things, and they do not know me or require me, and yet here I am." He walked from the Godswood and found Arianne sitting in the dark without candles, as if this northern night were a thing she might learn against her skin. She did not start when he entered. He sat beside her and did not speak, and she let him not speak. They shared the dark. That was a sort of wedding gift, too. Dawn arrived raw and efficient. Men climbed into saddles and felt their horses breathing like bellows beneath them. Riverrun, which had learned to watch men leave and return, arranged its face as if it were a mother seeing a son off to a craft that scared her and made her proud. Edmure wore a new tunic that made him look both boy and man. He had chosen to look as someone else's husband rather than his own lord. Catelyn stood with her hands clasped and, when Robb turned to look, gave him the look with which she had sent him downstairs as a child to apologize for breaking a cup. "Go, be honest, be brave, keep your voice low, come back to me as if you deserve to." The road to the twins had been used so much for the passing of complicated feelings that the ruts had adopted a moral posture. It held water in the same place every time. They did not ride with the noise of a host. They moved like a procession made by a god reluctant to be celebrated. At intervals, a man would sing a bit of a song to himself in a voice that did not wish to be heard. At intervals a horse would sneeze and a dozen men would flinch as if steel had been unsheathed. Arianne made conversation when conversation was needed and withheld it when silence would do less harm. Edmure rode at her side for a time and spoke of trout and of the sound the river makes at night when it decides to remember its source. She did not pretend to love the river's sound. She told him about sandstorms with a fondness one reserves for ungovernable cousins. Oberyn, who had insisted upon coming and had brought men who looked as if they had stolen sun and carried it in their eyes, sang a song that made a man in their company weep because it reminded him of a woman he had left who had hair the color of bread and a temper like flour after rain. The twins rose as if they had been planted to surprise men. They were ugly according to a certain kind of taste, square, certain, belligerent. The river went under their bridge as if forced to swallow. The bridge took the river like a man takes a favor and pretends he is not indebted. Standards lifted lazily atop the towers as if they had been awake all night and resented the morning. They were met by men whose faces were made to receive orders. They were led to a hall whose smell could not be disguised even if someone had tried to boil it away. Walder Frey's household had a scent that had traveled with it as a sort of family member. Old grease, wet wool, the powder of women who had to laugh too much, old men who would not die because there were still slights to record. Walder Frye sat upon his chair like a man who knew the chair had been waiting to hold him for too long and had gotten bored, but still did the job. His face had done what chicken skin does when left to dry. His eyes glinted with the duck's oil he had eaten for breakfast. His voice had the rasp of a man who saved his spit. "You have come to make me your friend," he said, without rising, without courtesy, with that cunning that could make men confuse it with wisdom if they were tired and hungry. "And you have come to bring me a husband for a daughter. How many daughters do you think I have, boy king? Enough for your enemies to find wives among them as well as your friends," Robb said, without bowing, because there was a way to keep a neck without losing a head. "And I am done offending you. I have brought you my uncle like a river brings spring. Too much and then enough." Walder laughed and pointed at Edmure as if he had found a coin in a latrine. "He looks like a trout," he said with joyless cheer. "He will do. And what have you brought me besides him, to make me forgive your manners, your grace? The scent of the desert? The stings of bees in silk? Your little wife whose eyes tell me she will remove the skin from my words if I do not watch? I am afraid of her, I will admit," he said, and everyone heard in that the promise that he was afraid of very little, mostly because he could make others be afraid for him. "I have brought you the respect owed a gatekeeper," Robb said, "and the promise that I will not forget that you held a bridge when others wished it destroyed. I have brought you a wedding in your hall, which is a sort of music that will make people speak your name kindly for at least 3 days. I will bring you peace upon this river for as long as I can make men respect a promise made in front of witnesses." Walder sniffed. "You have brought me words," he said. Look. He brought me a basket of words, signifying nothing and smelling like someone else's spit. "Ah, very well. I am an old man, and old men love weddings because they make them remember the weight of their own younger bodies. We will feed you. We will feed your little pieces of sand. We will feed your wolf if he will not bite the meat. And then I will marry off 1, 2, 3 of my girls and be rid of them, as a man loves to be rid of the health of others." Arian smiled, and the smile was made of silk cut on the bias so that it looked like one thing and fell like another. "I have never feared an old man's bad breath," she said conversationally, "but I do fear his teeth if they are still in good repair." Walder's laugh came again, more bored, more not bored. "Keep her," he said to nobody. "Keep her and breed her. Maybe she will make your sons clever. The north breeds them slow like snow. The south breeds them hot like wine. We need the middle." Oberyn, behind them, tilted his head a degree and then put it back up again, as if measuring the height of the ceiling and whether it would fall. Roose Bolton observed the room as if he were counting the cracks between stones and seeing in them the sort of opportunity a knife loves. Caitlin held the smallest piece of a prayer behind her teeth. Music began. Men moved. Women giggled with their hands over their mouths as if they were trying to hold perfume in a jar and not spill it. Servants brought out a dish whose surface shone with fat arranged with cautious pride. Edmure took the hand of a girl with hair the color of autumn straw, and she looked at him as if she had been told to look as if she loved him and had decided to obey because disobedience would bring different sorts of trouble. He smiled at her and meant it. They passed beneath the string of sweetmeats. The hall tried to look cheered and succeeded in looking like an old man trying to remember a day when he felt light. And here, because the gods, old and new, river and sand, are not cruel every day, the smell that rose next was only of food. No door closed, no blade flashed in the low light, no noise burst that broke the ribs of song. Walder Frye had learned to count, at least for a day, the number of men who would be angered by a wedding turned to murder when Dorne had brought spears with the sharp patience of desert wind, when Oberyn Martell sat with a smile that had nothing to do with amusement, when Roose Bolton's pale eyes reflected candlelight like a pond that does not show a face, and when a dire wolf lay in the yard with the patience of winter and the inevitability of weather. But the evening had other sorts of knives. There were words that found their mark. There was a cup that went down too quickly. A singer tried a song that belonged to another house and had to be gently steered towards safer verses. Walder made a remark about the North's appetite that was insult disguised as observation. and Arianne smiled and said something in the Dornish tongue that made the girls around her laugh like bells shaken against their will. And the insult thus died the small death such things sometimes do when strangers decide to do the difficult work of not hating one another out of habit. After the bedding, which was handled with a restraint that could be called discouraged rather than encouraged, some of Walder's older sons had their knuckles rapped by women who understood that mockery could turn its ankle on the stairs. Robb stood in a corner with Oberyn, and Oberyn said, "See how close the edge of things is? See how thin a knife is? We walk on them, every day. I do not say this to frighten you. I say it to keep you entertained." "I have enough entertainment," Robb said dryly. "You have a wife who will keep you alive," Oberyn said. "Do not squander that. If you must squander something, squander my patience and watch me find more." They left the twins in a morning that had the pain of too much drinking and too much relief in it. Men were polite to each other because to be otherwise would require energy none of them had. Walder Frey did not come to the yard to see them off. He sent one of his daughters with a basket of cakes that had been sugared to the point of insult. Edmure, who had slept with his new wife and discovered that kindness could occur in rooms full of ugliness, rode with a face that made women in the fields look up and then look down again, because they had work and because joy without caution had no place in their lives. The river ran as it always ran, indifferent to the fact that men had not killed other men in its house and grateful for the lack of blood it would not have to carry and forget. Ravens moved overhead like punctuation in a sentence the weather kept writing without asking for approval. The world had not turned itself upside down. It had tipped a degree or two perhaps toward sense. And that tip was all the difference in a room where knives had not been drawn. Back at Riverrun, letters arrived from King's Landing as if someone had opened a window and let wasps in. The Tyrell seal came with a scent of roses that made Meege Mormont sneeze violently and then curse flowers forever. The Queen's letter spoke of unity and of the need to secure the realm against mongrel kings and sand-addled traitors. It spoke in the plural that made its writer seem to have invited a host of herself to take up arms around her. Tyrion Lannister's careful, heretical hand did not appear upon any letter. Cersei's did, vicious and precise. Another letter bore a hand that had learned to hide its intentions in courtesy. It spoke of a father who wished peace before winter made murder less efficient. It spoke of bread and salt and fealty as if those words were inventions of a mind with a sense of humor. It was from Tywin Lannister. He used no threats. He did not need to. He wrote as if his enemies would eventually come into alignment with his design because gravity had not yet been declared illegal. Robb read and then read again and then set the letters aside as if he had been given a basket of snakes and a calendar. Arianne read over his shoulder and said, "The old lion writes like a man who has lost his taste for flesh but still chews it. We will remove his teeth." "It is not simple," Robb said. "No," she agreed. "Things worth doing aren't. We will start by turning a few of his clever men. We will continue by cutting supply. We will finish by asking someone close to him to forget his love for obedience and remember his love for living. There are always men who love living more than loyalty. You have such men too. Keep them busy. Keep them praised. Keep them far from my uncle." He laughed before he meant to. She kissed him then, not a show, not a promise of more, only a kiss between decisions, and in it he tasted the desert again and the iron of the north and the odd sweetness that comes when a man has done the right thing for reasons he can actually name. Far to the south, Doran Martell sat in the water gardens and felt the sun upon his knees like a benediction from a god who cost nothing and asked only that a man accept warmth when given. Children leapt, brown arms, white teeth, laughter that made his own throat ache with its foreignness. He kept his face composed and his mouth quiet because pain lived in him like a tenant who paid rent on time. Areo Hoda stood behind him with that patience that is not patience but fidelity. Doran read a letter from his daughter that had come wrapped in a small square of silk torn from the hem of her wedding garment. It still smelled of the north like a sweater dried by a fire and then worn to a chase, and he closed his eyes. He saw, as he often did, a tower and a floor and a smear and a little foot in the wrong place. He breathed. He said aloud, because he was alone enough to risk it, "Yes." It was not an exclamation. It was a release. In the shadow of Casterly Rock, A man with fair hair gathered his men to him with the precision of a farmer who can tell the weather by the way a crow tilts its head. He had built a career out of doing what frightened more careful men. He had chosen, long ago, a girl to protect and had failed spectacularly. He had murdered a king to save a city. He had lived with that. Now he heard of a wolf married to a son and a south that was moving north, and he thought, the world will be very interesting for a while and then it will be unbearable. Jaime Lannister smiled without mirth and asked for his horse. And in the Vale, men who thought themselves safe because mountains had grown around them like opinions counted their barley and flirted with prudence. The Eyrie remained beautiful and improbable. Sansa Stark, no, that name could not be said safely, looked at a window and saw, in her memory, a direwolf's paw upon snow. She whispered into her palm and swallowed the taste of what was left of her hope. In the Riverlands, Arya Starr, no. There were no names safe enough, walked with hunger and with a list in her mouth and did not yet know how the world had failed to become worse by a narrow, miraculous margin. Robb Stark, who had married a woman with hair like the desert at midnight and eyes like earth rich enough to grow a grove in, went to sleep most nights with mud on his boots and woke most mornings before the sun decided. He had married war and justice and a woman's mind. He had married the possibility that the bridge would hold even when insult had been built into its foam. He had married, also, the knowledge that men can be turned by the small lever of their own vanity, that a mother can forgive a son for surviving, that a wolf can lie before a fire and dream of running. He had married, though he did not know it fully yet, the idea that fire and ice were not enemies by nature, only by habit. And habit, under a good hand, can be unlearned. Morning came thin and colorless, a strip of pale cloth pulled across the sky, and the damp in the stones of Riverrun exhaled as the fires were coaxed back from ash. The kitchens woke first. The rhythm of knives traveled through the walls like news, and everything else followed: boots, muttered jokes, an argument about stale onions, the hiss and spit of fat deciding to be useful. The river spoke in the low way it did when it wanted men to stop talking and listen to its patient work. The banners were slack, and the birds along the walls were too intent upon the cold to be vain about their voices. Robb walked the yard and did not rush his steps. The weight on his belt was not heavier than yesterday. Only his sense of it had changed, the way a man who has carried a bucket for an hour suddenly notices the handles bite. He stopped twice to watch small things, because small things reminded him of the day's scale. A boy oiled tack with the care of someone tending a wound. 2 dogs circled a bone and found a compromise with growls. A smith's apprentice listened with serious attention to a dull bar being made to glow. Gray wind wandered ahead and returned, a soft procession of pause and breath. Arianne was at the arch near the top of the east stair, hands at her belt, hair braided but not disciplined into meekness. She wore a riding tunic that made do with northern cloth, and a Martell sun sewn small at the throat, as if she had pinned a fragment of home where warmth could find it. She watched a pair of spearmen from the green blood learning to plant their feet on flagstones that gave back their weight differently than sand, and the faintest irritation worked in her mouth, affection for the men and annoyance at the weather's stubbornness. "You wake as if the night and you have signed a truce," she said when he came up to her. "It lets you go, but it looks over the wall to see how far." "I dream as if walls could think," he said. "The yard carries other men's sleep around in its dust. Good practice for breathing amidst them." "Did you dream sense?" "I dreamt a door that wanted to be a window." "Leave it a door. Those who think they can climb through anything end by falling with both legs caught." She glanced at his face and then at his hands. "Catelyn waits for you with tea that has been steeped long enough to count as counsel. I am asked to be there or not as I choose." "You are asked," he said, and she was already moving before the last word left him. The sort of compliance that was like a compliment people seldom received. The chamber smelled of wool and smoke and the faint sweet of dried apple from a bowl by the hearth. Catelyn had chosen a chair that did not favor her bones. She sat in it with a straightness that told the room it did not own her. Brynden stood by the window, tasting the morning as if it were wine that needed an opinion. Edmure's face was new-shaved. The rawness of the skin suited him, a man done with a first something and beginning to be past fear of it. Rosalind sat near him, slight and quiet. She had doe-brown eyes that tried not to show that they had been taught to hide everything and had not quite learned. She smoothed her skirt with hands that wanted work. "Your uncle's letters," Caitlin said, and held up a strip of parchment with creases that told more than the words did. Hoster would have quarreled with the ink and forgiven the contents. "We will live with both." Brynden snorted. "My brother liked his battles like his accounts, neatly reconciled. Times like these are an insult to bookkeeping." Robb took the letter. It spoke of forage and of rapids. It noted that the raiders in Lannister colors had grown too accustomed to the way their horses' legs found purchase on certain hills. It asked for patience with peasants who had no patience left to be hired. It ended with a sentence that, for Brynden, was a cheer. "I have not yet been forced to admire my enemies." Rosalind lifted her head. "My father sent word this morning." Her voice was soft but steady. "He hopes your uncle will forgive that the septon he offered had a cough. We found another from a village up the road. I thought, my lord, your uncle prefers local devotions in any case." Edmure squeezed her fingers once. "We had the words that mattered." The cough made no vow. Arianne's glance flicked from Rosalind to Caitlin and back, mapping the distance between them. "The cough did no harm," she said. "Vigins do, but we survived one, and that can be made to matter more than the rest." Caitlin poured tea as if its steam carried something she needed to see rise and disappear. "Walder Frey sends cakes and a promise that his bridge will be neutral if men do not force it to choose. I treat all his promises as if they were convalescents. I will not count upon their strength until they have proven they can stand and walk from one end of a room to the other." "An old man's pride is a bridge with missing planks," Brynden observed. "We cross with care, but we cross." "Word from White Harbor?" Robb asked. "Ships," Caitlin answered, and her mouth softened the way it did when she spoke of things built by patience. "Manderley is committed to building until his kitchens complain. He will move grain and men if he is not starved for tar. He asks only that we not squander sailors on rivers that drown armies." "Wyman Manderley asked only for a song when he was a boy," Brynden said. "Now he wants songs and ships. Old men grow ambitious in winter." Rosalind lifted her eyes and took a breath that wanted to tremble and did not. "If we are speaking of crossings, my father has nephews who will not forgive your insult, your grace. They will still send knives if a hall is bright and full of music. Their pride goes to bed with them at noon when they are drunk and wakes angry. I do not say this to harm my father. He is what he is, and he has been kind to me in his way. But the Black Walder is not patient. He is not Riasona.
Bleh.
If you expect him to obey even Walder Frey, you will wait for sense as if it were a storm that never came." Edmure looked at her profile and smiled just enough. "You have courage," he said. "Better than courage. Honesty with your own blood. That is not the easiest form." "I make a good wife, my lord," she replied without boast or flinch. "I wish to keep you breathing. You will forgive me if I am direct." Caitlin's gaze touched the girl and warmed a degree. A candle allowed to be a candle. "Directness sits well here," she said. "Speak what you know when you know it. We have plenty of men who bring tidings a week late in a language that was not needed." "Then I add this," Rosalind said, hands quiet in her lap. "Lothar will soothe. Black Walder will not. Do not confuse them and think you have one over the wrong one." "We will not," Robb said. Grey Wind, who had lain behind his chair as if carved into the shadows, opened his eyes and closed them again, a warning that felt like a heartbeat under the floor. When the council had bled into the day and all the sense had been made to stand in line, they rose. Arianne did not leave with Robb. She went down to the yard where Oberyn had taken it upon himself to be obvious. He was at the center of a circle of men with spears, and his voice cut the morning like a blade that had been sung to all night. "No," he was saying with the patience reserved for men who hoped to be mortal and useful. "No, your feet are not ornaments. Plant them as if your enemy were trying to walk through them into your house. The spear is an argument. Your arm is only the messenger. If you try to charm a man with your hands, he will marry you. If you try to convince his legs to fold, he will die." Again, slowly, Think about someone you love who laughs with their eyes. Plant your feet for them. A woman from Bear Island, Alysanne Mormont, whose knuckles were a form of punctuation, called across the yard. You think we need your south to teach us to be stubborn? I think you need my south to remind you that stubbornness is not enough when your enemy is tall and wears a horse. Oberyn called back and grinned. Stubbornness is for men who are falling. I prefer to be the reason they do. He moved. He did not seem to move so much as to make the air decide it was in the wrong place, and the spear in his hand became the extension of a thought. He snapped the butt down against the flagstone so cleanly that the sound was its own word. He set the point at the height of a horse's knee with the bored accuracy of repetition. The men around him did as he did because in their bodies they felt they were being invited into competence. Arianne watched without craving the center. She had grown up inside such circles, practicing until her breath became its own measure of a good lesson. Roose Bolton watched from the shade and clapped once, softly. The sound of paste struck with a spoon. Elegant, he said to no one, and the word fell to the ground and lay there like a ribbon everyone stepped over without mention. He had a small room along the western walk that he had made his own with nothing more than lack of interest in anyone else's. He retired to it when the yard had had enough of his eyes. Inside, it smelled of iron and beeswax and something sharper. A tray waited with 3 small ceramic cups and a flask of dark liquid. Another tray held a basin and a knife laid out upon lint. He dismissed his boy with a glance that felt like a cold finger along the jaw and sat. He rolled back the sleeve of his tunic and applied the leech to his skin with a care that was almost respect. It took purchase with a small greedy sound. He watched it, and it watched nothing, and the line of his mouth did not move. The letter he wrote had to look like a different letter. He was competent at such things. His hand was precise without being fussy. He made the shapes any competent maester would approve, and yet there was a lifelessness to the script a truly learned man would have disliked. He did not write to Tywin Lannister. That would have been vulgar. He wrote to a minor functionary whose name he remembered from a winter spent in King's Landing when he had counted doorways and discovered how many corners a man could stand in without being seen. He wrote of the river's level and the state of fish. He mentioned by chance that a certain lord would be traveling north with a certain number of men at a certain time. He wrote as a friend writes to a friend about nothing, which is to say he wrote like a man hiding a small, bright stone in the bread of his letter. When he had finished, he folded the parchment carefully, warmed the wax, and pressed a seal with a small symbol that meant less than it appeared to mean. He did not use his own. He had acquired this one from a man who had died in a way that had not disturbed the stewards. Then he released the leech back into the basin and watched the thin, inhuman gratitude with which it sought water. He pressed a rag to his arm and considered his future as if it were an object held up to the light and turned. Gray Wind was not in the corridor when he opened the door, but the absence had a direction and a temperature. The quiet around the room learned his scent and considered it food. Roose Bolton closed the door and made his face into an empty bowl. Edmure found a corner of the yard in which to embarrass himself in peace. He tried a longbow he had no business trying today. Rosalind watched and did not advise. She kept her hands tucked into her sleeves and let the wind worry her hair. She wore a small smile that had not yet learned where to rest upon a man's face. He missed twice. His third shot found wood and stayed. He looked at her like a boy who had climbed the first branch of a tree without falling. "I am a better fisherman than archer," he said. "I am a better listener than talker," she replied and drew nearer. "But I am learning to speak because a woman is not love. Et for silence. Sometimes she is safest for it, but not loved. I will not ask that of you," he said, honestly enough that she believed him for at least an hour into the future. She smiled with the relief of a younger sister whose elder had finally learned to share bread. Later, Robb walked to the dungeon where the air was thick with the old wrongs of stone and men. The guard at the door looked relieved to have his king as a reason to interrupt his own thoughts. Rickard Karstark sat on a low bench and arranged his anger as if it were a cloak he folded and unfolded for warmth. He had grown lean with it. He looked up without standing. It was a pride that had dressed itself in resignation and found the fit inconvenient. "You denied me a justice of my own hand," he said before courtesy could be asked to work. "I do not forget. I do not forgive. I sit here and count. When my counting turns from days to names, I will be the sort of man you have taught me to be." Robb stood with the bars between them and felt the unpleasant rightness of the iron. "You killed captives. I put you here because I was not ready to put your head upon a block. And now that you are wed and feel yourself more man," Karstark sneered. The sneer seemed practiced, clean and bright with wearing. "Will you open the gate and swing the axe?" A footstep behind Robb resolved into Arianne's voice. "Your lord knows the cost of a head on the ground. He won't pay it when more coin can be purchased for the same execution." Karstark's eyes slid beyond Robb's shoulder. Contempt cooled. "Dorne sends its women to speak of coin. Dorne sends its future queens to speak of the cost of foolishness," she said evenly. "House Karstark can be turned to usefulness again if it is not asked to eat all its grief at once. The Ironborn are not finished in the north. They will make cruelty in your lands to prove their songs true. Ride that way. Ride north under guard, stripped of command, to rescue what is yours from men who sing when women cry. Earn your way back to the king's chamber door, and then ask to be allowed to kneel. You may yet be a man your children can speak of without their mouths filling with the taste of dirt." "What does a southern girl know of my children?" Karstark rasped. But the words were thinner than the conviction that had brought them. The cell had given him more time to think than his pride liked. The name of his dead sons lived in his night teeth. He hated the princess for the smoothness of her face in this damp place. He hated himself for hearing sense in a voice he wished to dismiss. He swallowed, and it sounded like apology without merit. Robb watched the small movement of thought in the man. "If you swear not to harm a prisoner while you breathe," he said, "I will send you north under the eye of Meej Mormont's second. You will carry my letters. You will do no judging. You will fetch and carry and fight and not command and not pronounce until you have forgotten the taste of killing to teach grief to someone who had nothing to do with your sons' deaths. If you break that oath, I will not be merciful again." Ricard Karstark closed his eyes. Their lids had learned to be thinner down here. When he opened them, his voice had dropped a quarter of its weight. "I swear," he said, "by my house and by what is left to me. I swear." "Good," Arianne said, and her contempt moved aside to allow a small, respectful space. "Stand, then. A man who has decided something should use his legs." She turned and left first, because leaving a man upright with a task is a kind of gift that does not require witness. That night was a night for letters and a night for the tired. Robb stood at the table with Caitlin and Brynden and Arianne and Oberyn and Roose and the map that had begun to look tired of being pointed at. The ink pots had grown indignant at how many quills had been dipped into them. There were too many candles at first. One by one they were killed as if a silent order had been given by a thrifty god. "We pull to the north with winter coming," Brynden said, finger traveling up the page as if a fish had turned and decided to swim home despite the cold. "We must. The Ironborn would make a language of taking if they were allowed. Winterfell is hollow as a skull, and your people would rather die of emptiness than of someone else's laugh inside their houses. And if we move," Roose said, voice smooth as water poured upon polished stone, "we leave the river in the hands of men who enjoy burning other men's dinners. The West will bite when it sees our back." "I will bite back," Oberyn said cheerfully. "Allow me a road and a little while. The men who carry your lion will begin to notice their ankles and wonder. We will redden a few supply carts and whisper lies in the ears of farmers who thought themselves safe behind golden lions. The important thing is to frighten accountants. They panic beautifully." Arianne pointed with the quill she had not put down for hours. "Prince's Pass," she said. "We push a bone through there and trouble the dog's throat. Dorne can hold rough hills while writing letters. We can spend fewer lives and more ink while keeping a door jammed. Meanwhile, we make mischief here." She tapped the line along which Lannister messengers rode with more pride than sense. "Little knives. Gossip that becomes a missing purse that becomes a missing head. Your uncle holds the river like a man who knows he is carrying a baby over ice. Your mother keeps the hall. You go north. And you, Robb said, stay and make certain the pass is a bone not easily spat, and keep our river lords from learning to hate the sound of Dornish speech and our Dornish from deciding we are a comedy. Gladly, Arianne said and smiled, and in it was an appetite for work, and for the pleasure of making people better than they wish to be. I will also teach 3 of your ladies to speak enough of my tongue to gossip accurately. Bad rumor F. Flourishes in translation. We should not pretend the lion will sit still, Roose murmured, drifting around the table like a slow fish in a barrel. Tywin has learned to count. He will decide where we will be a month from now and place his small stones accordingly, then deny he has put them there. Then we be elsewhere, Brynden said. He smiled without teeth. It is what we do when we are not dying. Catelyn had listened with patience, but when the conversation circled back to where it had begun, she put a finger upon the map and every man shut his mouth. There will be letters to Manderley and to Lady Meech. There will be a word for Barrowton where a woman rules while claiming she does not care for anyone's crown. There will be a raven to the neck. I will not have my son go north without the reeds in his hands. She glanced at her daughter-in-law and added without emphasis, and I will need you to visit Seaguard and take the measure of Jason Mallister's memory. He has been loyal so long he may develop opinions. I like opinions, Arianne said. They are like dogs that want exercising. If you do not run them, they chew your furniture. Then run them, Catelyn said, and the small smile she permitted herself flickered and was gone. Go tomorrow. Take 2 of your men who do not pretend to be anything but exactly what they are. Speak with Lord Jason of raids, ships, and what will convince the Trident to forget it ever loved red lions upon its banks. Oberyn set his palms on the table, leaned, and let the room take his voice like spice sprinkled into stew. I will go west with 150 men who can pass as less and be more. I will taste their roads. I will send you names of men who might be persuaded that Tywin's name is not worth the price his servants pay to wear it. If I find the mountain, I will make him a valley. He looked at the quills as if they were swallows that had begun to annoy him and then looked up. I am not patient, but I will pretend to be if the pretending can be used as a knife. Pretend, Robb said. Then be yourself when the knife is ready. After the council, the hall deepened into night with the sensible sighs of a household that had taught itself thrift in all things, sleep included. Robb sat with his elbows on his knees before the fire in a small room off the eastern corridor. Arianne came in without knocking because they had crossed that threshold of familiarity. She could enter like a thought he had already been thinking. He looked up. The blaze had eaten the logs to a glow. Sparks drifted up with a hunger not quite satisfied. My mother asked you to go to Seaguard and drive a lord like a team of oxen over a plowed field. She asked me to remind a polite man that courtesy has uses other than avoiding offense. Arianne sat on the stone beside him and placed her palms to the warmth as if asking the fire a question. I will see how much poetry the sea put in him this week. Then I will stack it upon a shelf and we will speak of ships in winter. He watched her profile, the fine plane of her cheek catching the light like half of a coin. I asked Karstark to go north. It will make enemies of some who prefer to head to roll over a promise to be kept. But I am tired of collecting resentments I can't eat. I approved, she said, and he could not tell whether she teased him by pretending authority. Men who have killed in grief must be taught how to kill in service again, or else they become the sort who kill for habit. He will learn something in the cold that the South cannot teach. He rubbed his thumb along the ridge of a knuckle and thought of Winterfell the way one thinks of a word that used to mean simplicity. When we go north, I will leave you here and Seaguard and the pass. In a net I hope will catch all the nonsense men think to throw at you. You leave me in a place where your mother watches my back and my front, Arianne said. I call that a luxury. You go north with men you have taught to listen. They will listen to you and you will listen to the land. I will send you 6 letters for every one you answer. None of them will ask whether you are eating. All of them will tell you which men are trying to grow agendas behind the kitchen. They won't all be men, he said. No, she agreed. The wise women will bake you politics in breads, and you will eat them and be nourished and not know. I will write their names large, so you do not forget them when the next feast makes you generous. He leaned his head back against the stone and watched the soot stir in the fire's small drafts. Do we insult the gods by being practical instead of pious? They are used to being insulted, she said, and they enjoy it. It gives them an excuse to do what they would have done anyway. We should be honest with them, he said. If only so I can be honest about not needing their permission. Pray to yours, she said. I will say my little prayers to mine, and between us the gods will be flattered and distracted. Meanwhile, we will do the work. He reached for her hand. He did not pull her closer, not yet. He held the hand, and the fire chose that moment to crack once, as if someone in the world had decided something important and set a stick upon a log with more purpose than usual. Arian left for Seagard in pale weather that had not yet decided whether to rain. The Martell banner went with her at a sober height. She took with her a slender, scar-scored man named Timon Santigar, whose spear work was uneasily precise, and a woman named Nalia who spoke both the Riverland's inflections and the Dornish in a way that made men think her from their house and women think her from their village. She took 2 northern riders who had learned her ways and did not mind the sharpness of her voice when she wanted speed. The gates let her through with a sense that something you wanted would come back because it had promised you it would, and because it was. Proud enough to keep its word. Oberyn left the same morning by the other road. His men looked like men who had found mischief and asked it to sit in their saddlebags. They carried coils of rope, small casks of pitch, a handful of letters written in various hands and sealed with the wrong seals, and the cheerful nerve of people who had lived their whole lives making authority lose track of its sandals. Oberyn rode smiling, and he smiled as if he had invented the sun. And the sun, flattered, condescended to shine upon the wet road for an hour before sulking back behind dull cloud. Before noon, a raven landed upon the wall. Angry at the distance it had been forced to fly. The maester coaxed away the capsule and untied the ribbon, and the letter came to Robb with unusual speed because the boy who took it had been told that sometimes words move faster than knives. It was from White Harbor again. It told him a list of names of ships being built, names that had returned from being sunk and names that were being made for the first time, and it told him of a whisper from the narrow sea about a sail captain who might be bought with something other than coin. He pocketed the letter as if it were a talisman, and that night read it aloud to Catelyn and Brynden and smiled when forced to say Trident's bride without choking on the pretty. There is a place, he thought, for sweetness even in war, if only so men will be confused about when to sneer. The next day began with rain and did not end with it. It soaked everything with a leisurely cruelty. Men ate in it and argued in it and mended their boots in it and pretended not to miss the brief winter suns few had learned to appreciate. Gray Wind shook himself at the doorway to the hall in ritual offense, and then came to lie upon the rushes with a dignity that did not admit discomfort. Robb took the courtyard with him, the 2 of them mere outlines in the downpour, and walked. No one stopped him to burden him with small requests. Everyone who had a mind at all had boarded up their idea against the rain and waited. Roose Bolton stood alone on the covered walk, hood up, hands folded, gazing out as if the weather were a consulting partner. Robb moved toward him because a man needs to move toward cold to keep from building a story about it. You are very patient with wet, he said. I have never found complaint to improve damp, Roose said, and moved his eyes to the wolf and back. You have decided to go. I have, Robb said. When the river gives us a day that makes traveling something other than cruelty, we go. Karstark goes with me. Great John stays. Brynden stays. My mother stays. My wife stays. I'll wrap the north around the part of me that can walk. The north will be wrapped around other men, Roose observed. They will have learned to call it cloth and not a place. They will not give it back quickly. Then they will be undressed in public, Robb said. He felt the rain settle into his hair the way an argument settles into a reluctant listener. Any counsel you would share, my lord? Roose offered one of his precise little smiles. Call mercy what it is even when it looks like cowardice to men who lust for posture. You cannot match Tywin in patience at cruelty. You can surpass him in thrift with your men. Spend only what buys something. And do not eat with strangers without your wolf in the room. Robb nodded. It was sound enough. It did not tell him who Roose intended to be when men decided to eat him. But sound advice often comes from mouths that intend to make noise later. He left the man there and let the rain hide both of them from any watching eye that thought too well of itself. Seaguard stones shed rain like a thing too proud to be softened. Arianne arrived near dusk and was greeted with a courtesy that had been practiced upon better days. Jason Mallister's eyes had not forgotten how to flicker with vanity when they needed to. He offered her a haul and dry clothes and a position near the fire as if he believed she would be pleased to be set near warmth in the north. She accepted everything as if she had asked for it and received exactly what she had expected. "Your bells have a voice," she said after they had all done their first sitting and sighing. "Not all bells do. Some die in the air. Yours reach for the water and change it." Jason Mallister looked delighted and then tried not to be. "They function. They let men know whether a friend approaches or bad weather wearing a sail. Sometimes they are the only reason a man goes to the wall to be reminded he is alive." "I have come to ask you for ships without masts," Arianne said. "The kind you put men into for reasons other than going to sea. I need river craft. Quiet, shallow, stupid-looking things that can carry clever men. I need oars. I need men who can be bribed to help and who will not be offended when I pay them on time. I need a statement from Seaguard that says you love this river more than you love the sound of your own stories about it." Jason Mallister grinned, pleased to be caught. "We have skiffs that have only sunk once," he admitted. "We have men who believe a river is a person. We have boys who know where the current hides and where it lies and pretends to be obedient. We can give you 3 raiders and 6 skiffs in a week if the weather is not actively trying to murder carpenters." "Good," Arianne said. "We will murder men who need it." He laughed with less effort this time and then sobered. "The Lannister men have taken to creeping near our inlets at night. They did not know which blackness to choose this far from their rock. They are learning. We have frightened some with tricks. The rest need to be shown their families cannot eat on what they think courage is." "We will put fear in the water," Arianne said. "It is where it belongs." They ate fish and the fish tasted of cold hunger. Arianne listened to a story about a storm again because men who Eve with the sea require such attention. She asked 3 questions that made Jason Mallister sit straighter and like her more and be afraid of her a sensible amount. She sent a letter back to Riverrun telling Catelyn 2 names that had offered sentiment and 1 that had offered men. And she slept with the window cracked to hear if the bells told the truth in rain. They did. She dreamt of a desert and a river arguing and woke with the satisfaction of having been in the right place in her dream. Oberyn's road west grew narrower as his grin grew more genuine. He spent an afternoon under a hedge while 3 Lannister riders tried to decide how to pass a cart that had broken its axle in the middle of their plan. He stopped at a village where the alewife had opinions about every house in 3 counties and paid for all of them with 2 compliments and a promise to come back and make her youngest son into a singer. He sent a man into a supply train with the simple aim of stealing 2 mules. The man came back with the mules, a story about a soldier who had helped him because he had been told that if the mules were any slower the bread would mold, and a map drawn with a burnt stick upon the side of a cheese. "You see," Oberyn said, pointing at the messy lines with a delight that made his men understand why they were not bored. "There is sense to be coaxed out of foolishness. We coax, then we cut." At a ford west of the Red Fork where the water pretended to be tame until a man tried to cross, Brynden Tully set a trap that felt more like teaching than like slaughter. He let the raiders believe the shallow was shallower, let them ride 3 abreast, and then let a dam he had taught a group of boys to build with stakes and brush give way at the moment their horses had decided to put weight upon the wrong legs. Men screamed the same way everywhere. Horses thrashed the same. The practical work of pulling drowning enemies from water in order to press their faces into mud went on with a steadiness as old as any house name. Bryndon's men took no pleasure in it. If there was satisfaction, it looked like 2 hard lines at the sides of a mouth. Gregor Clegane was not a man to be trapped that way. He smelled mud and called it a lie. He was not there. But his men were, and when Oberyn arrived 2 days later and saw the stakes still showing their sharp heads at the river's edge, he put his hand to one and said, "We will make him cross somewhere he believes will kill us and discover it kills him instead." "You make it sound like a feast," Brynden answered dryly. "It will be for me," Oberyn said, and he smiled as if he had remembered a song from childhood and found it did not embarrass him. In the Vale, the air remained cut glass, the sky a precise thing the rest of the country did not care to imitate. A girl with a new name stood upon a balcony and watched clouds clot and tear, and in her throat the habit of singing sat like a stone she had not managed to swallow. Littlefinger came behind her once and set a hand upon the rail, as if it were something he had given her and would take back. He talked of the South with a careful art of omission. He said king without north, and he said queen with too much ease. He said Martell, the way a man says alliance, with hunger and contempt. "The Dornish have always been trouble to sensible men, Elaine," he remarked. "They do not fall where you push, and they do not push where you would fall. They pretend their women are men and their men women. It makes a mess of the old recipes. But I admire a good kitchen fight. It stirs appetites." She turned her face just enough that he could see one eye. "It is said the king in the river has married a Dornish princess." "Many things are said," he sighed. "Men say them because their tongues get bored. The thing to ask yourself is which words are building something while they are being spoken and which are only sound. If it is true, he will find himself warmer at night and colder by day. He has made enemies who do not sit quietly at home while their stew boils." She looked back at the peaks and thought obstinately, "He is my brother, and he is not a boy anymore, and if he is colder by day, I hope he learns to wear a cloak without forgetting how to run." She pressed her lips together to keep the thought from being eaten by the man behind her. It is dangerous to feed clever men with anything that smells like hope. North of the neck, fog crept like a beast that believes in stealth. Ramsay Snow rode in it as if it had been made for him. His laugh did not travel far. The fog smothered it. Thank the gods, but he did not care. Winterfell stones had cooled, and where men had hoped they would warm soon with a lord's return, they resigned themselves to the cold and grew thin. He sent letters with the tone of a lord and the signature of a bastard. He hunted because he believed skin is a thing a man owes the man who wants it. He wrote to a father who preferred to read silence and say nothing to fireplaces. The letter Roose sent did not tell Ramsay to stop, told him to wait. It told him to send word on men who still carried the Stark in their mouth and whether their fear made them more stubborn or more likely to betray their own fields. It told him to find spears that could be raised with the promise of sharpening old grievances. It did not tell him to spare. Roose never told anyone to spare. He told them to spend only what could be replaced. Manderley's men bent their backs over ribs of ships and cursed cheerfully, the way men curse when their hands are warm and their bellies full of fish. They sang songs about an ocean they had not yet seen this year in their anger. Wyman laughed when he read Robb Stark's letter and then put a piece of eel in his mouth and chewed until the letter made more sense. "We will feed his north," he said, "because someone must, and because when a king writes for food, he is a man I can believe. Yesi. Ent 3 ships sooner than he should have and told his steward to make soup where bread should have done." He wrote to a man in Bravos, and his letter spoke of fish and of debt and of a girl who once had eaten sweets at his table and laughed like a belle easily impressed. The seal he put upon that letter was one he had saved for a different day. But days seldom do what you want when you save the good knives. At Riverrun, Catelyn kept the house like a commander who pretends not to be one because men get frightened when their mothers take sharp things away. She heard petitions and had the gift of sending each man away believing his burden had been accepted into a basket that would not drop it. She took Rosalind with her twice and let her stand at her shoulder and learned that some women are teachers without saying they intend to teach. Once, when a woman came in with a blue bruise upon her cheek and a story about a husband who had found a drink that turned his hand into a hammer, Catelyn dismissed the man with 3 sentences. He did not forget and sent him to work with Bryndon's supply lines where men who hit bridges paid for it. Afterwards, she sat with the woman and the woman did not speak for an hour, only breathed like someone finally allowed to do so. Rosalind poured tea and watched. She would not be a silent wife, she decided, even if her silence was worth money. A raven brought a small thing wrapped in oilcloth that turned out to be a braid of hair tied with a bit of metal. Oberyn's flourish. He sent news carved in joke. He wrote the word cabbage with great seriousness because it meant something to him and the men moving a particular cart near the Golden Tooth. He told Arianne she would like the way innkeepers lied better here. They did it with style and a sort of relief. He told Robb a thing about the mountain he had learned. There was a cook who had been dismissed because he could not bear the sound of bones, and this cook had the habit of praying aloud by mistake. He wrote not to Catelyn but to the hall with care. He sent a list of names of men who would betray you for money but would keep your secrets for pride. He had a way of handling men as if they were swords that belonged to someone else. He examined them, regarded their balance, and put them back where they could be found when needed. A rider came in from the east with a strip of red cloth knotted to his wrist. He slid from the saddle and stood for a moment, rain making a mess of his face, and then said, "Gregor." He had lost his horse half a league back and run. He put his hand upon the wall as if to hold it up. Robb did not call a council yet. He called Brynden. The Blackfish listened to the man's story. It was only a word, really, the mountain that rides, and the way he said it meant that a village had ceased to be a village, that animals had been made to scream and children to learn the language of trampling. He placed his hand upon the man's shoulder once, because comfort should be as economical as good strategy, and then he turned to Robb. "He is here," he said. "He will not be here long. He will move like a plague that has not learned caution. We can catch his cough and make it worse." Robb nodded. "Where?" Brynden tapped the map, not at the village that had just been bled, but at the road beyond a ford that had dried more than once this month and could be made to choose a different mood. "There. We put men in mud. We put men in trees. We teach him that his size is a lie if he cannot put his feet where he thinks he can. We pull 3 of his men off horses and break their necks against stones. We take 2 alive. The rest we allow to run until they find their master and tell him a story we have written." Oberyn returned as if the weather had decided to make him a character in its play. He came wet and smiling. "I have missed the smell of river," he announced. "I have missed modesty in villages. I have missed the way your men have faces like carved furniture. Take me where I can teach someone good posture with a spear." Brynden grunted something that meant yes and handed him the work he wanted. They went in quiet, as much as men can, leaving the hall with a sense of absence that felt like intelligence in the air. The rain stopped so that it could listen. They waited for 2 days. The men in the trees became leaves and then became the memory of leaves. The men in the mud learned to be mud and then learned to love it because it meant a man could pass within 3 paces and not notice that a spear point had been taught his name. The wolf did not go. Grey Wind lay at Robb's side and watched the road with a hunger that was not for meat. Once, a rabbit came and sat at the edge of the wood and made small motions of nose and ear. The wolf's muscles did not move. His eyes stayed on the road. He remembered lesson as well as any commander. When the mountain came, the road knew first. The sound of his men rode ahead, smaller noises trying to convince the larger that all was well. The horses sweated more than the day required. A dog that had been trailing for meat put its head down and turned into the grass. The giant at the center looked precisely as reported, which was to say he looked like a story a child would tell about a man made into a wall. His helm was a bad joke. His sword had no humor at all. Men around him wore the faces men wear when proximity to greatness is indistinguishable from proximity to death. The signal was not a shout. It was the movement of a hand at a particular moment when a blue scrap of cloth had reached the level of the mountain's knee. A tree's shadow moved wrong, and the first spear licked the air. A horse went down and a man with it, and the scream that came up out of that fall ran along the road in either direction. Oberyn came out of the wet beside the road and put a spear in a thigh with insult, not anger. Brynden's men did what they had been told to do, which was to be as forgettable as mud A. And then be suddenly something else. The mountain felt the ambush like a man feels rain after saying it would not come. He did not panic. He was too big to panic. He turned. He bellowed. He killed the wrong man first because he was the easiest man to reach. His sword made a noise that had made other men believe in the end of their own stories. He tried to push his horse forward, but the horse, bless it, had begun to work out that there were stakes buried where it would prefer stakes not be. It danced backwards. It gave him a moment of dignity. Then it fell under him. Oberyn smiled like a man offered something he had wanted since he was a boy. He went near enough to make a map of the man's movements. He did not attempt the killing then. The first lesson of killing a mountain is to make it move until it admits joints. The second is to make it bleed where the bleeding will inconvenience it rather than remind it of its grandeur. He cut a tendon in an ankle. He went away. He appeared again and nicked a hand. He went away. The spearmen did not aim for the chest. They aimed for men around the giant, for horses, for one shoulder that carried the arrogance of a crest. The field learned a rhythm. The rhythm learned to be a plan. The mountain shouted, and his men pulled him out of the ground and back into motion, and then they were a mass moving wrong but moving. Brynden did not chase with enthusiasm. He sent 3 men to chase with malice and caution, and he let the rest stand where they were and not die for a boast. 2 men were caught alive. They spat. They tried to break their own necks. One foamed. The other wept and begged and told stories without being asked, as men do when their fear has been handled by professionals. They spoke of a camp to the west where there was a cook who could not bear the sound of bones. They said the mountain had laughed at something he had never laughed at before. A story about a boy who had been stupid enough to think he could become tall by standing on a stool, and then they asked to be killed. Brynden obliged and had somebody say a word over their bodies, not because he believed it mattered, but because habit keeps men human more efficiently than commandments. Oberyn sat upon a low wall and bled from a small cut in his lip and hummed to himself. Robb came and stood with his hands on his hips and looked at the road where blood and mud had begun their old conversation. "That's not the end of him," he said.
No, Oberyn replied.
"But it is the beginning of his forgetting he is a myth. We have reminded him that he is made of parts. Men made of parts die. That is how we will educate him." "We must educate the men who follow him," Robb said. "Oh," Oberyn smiled. "I will write books for them." They went back to Riverrun with a sense one gets after preventing a crime rather than achieving a victory. The hall took them in with the relief of a household that had not yet grown so used to loss that it greeted new faces with suspicion. Catelyn counted everyone coming and allowed herself to blink in a way that made her look years younger and older in the same heartbeat. Rosalind listened to the tale in the kitchen and went to pray without anyone telling her where to go to do that. A boy polished a spear with the respect of someone who thought it might be a musician's instrument if a different life had occurred. At night, the rain returned, soft this time, and the river made a sound like someone turning pages. Robb stood at the window of the solar and let the damp come to his face. Arianne returned a day later as if she had been made of the same substance as weather. She smelled of salt and smoke and of something sweet he could not name until she told him the people of Seaguard put rose hips in a certain tea in winter to insist upon summer. She told him that Jason Mallister had agreed to 3 bargains and 1 courtesy that would produce more than the bargains. She told him there were 6 boats more than she had asked for because pride is a useful muscle if you learn when to stretch it. He told her of the road and the giant and the beginning of a book written with cuts. They did not embrace first. They exchanged news until the room agreed they had fed it. Then they set their bodies against each other like men putting a roof tile where it belongs. There were gentler days. In one, Arianne stood with 2 of the Mormont girls in the yard and laughed openly at the way a northern woman teaches a southern one to butcher a stag. In another, Catelyn and Robb knelt in the godswood and did not speak at all. In yet another, a flock of geese landed at the bend of the river and made such indignant noises that 3 men in mail stopped and watched for 10 minutes as if that spectacle were the only war worth attending. The world will place kindness in a day sometimes like a coin in a pocket you thought empty. It did not last long because that is what days do when they are working. Word came from the west that Tywin's men had begun to map the movements of small groups that made them nervous at night. Word came from King's Landing that the Queen had dismissed 2 men for wearing the wrong expressions and had hired a 3rd for never having one. Word came from White Harbor that 3 boys had drowned helping set a keel, and that Wyman had fed their families until grief had time to sit down and breathe. Word came from the neck that the reeds had shifted in a way a reed would understand and that the marsh had decided to help. Word came from Bear Island that Meej had taught a man to respect a girl's spear with a lesson he would not forget if he lived to be 80. Word came from the Dreadfort that it existed. Robb set the day. The river rose 2 fingers and fell 1. The sky forgot to be cruel for a day and a half. He drew the line through his maps that meant we go. He stood in the yard and watched men check their harness and adjust their jokes. He embraced Brinden with the sort of squeezed tea. Hat means I am leaving a piece of myself here and I expect it to be in its place when I return. He took his mother's hands and kissed them without shame and without words because words have already been given their work and should not be asked to do more. He looked for Roose and found him at the edge of the gathering, eyes like water that has never believed in fish, and nodded as one does to a tree that will not move and could be shade if it wanted. Arian hung a medallion around his neck. It was not sacred. It was practical, a little piece of hammered copper stamped with a sun and a wolf on either side. "Don't lose it," she said. "Men who see only one side of a thing should be reminded the other exists." "I will come back and you will tell me what I missed," he said. "You will come back and I will tell you what I ruined," she replied. Her smile was private and sharp and kind. They kissed, not extended, not chaste, something made for a morning and not for a song. Gray wind brushed past them and brushed his flanks against her skirt and then sat with a sigh that said, "Leave if you must. Dinner will be here when you decide you are hungry again." They rode. The road north is long even when it is not long. The air begins to carry differently, as if it has had longer to consider its position upon the world and has become a critic. Men stopped talking as much. They saved words for needing to be funny and for needing to be precise. Robb watched the land the way a shepherd watches his sheep graze, counting the small movements and deciding whether the flock had decided to go somewhere it shouldn't. At Moat Cailin, the ruins stood as if architecture could be a memory a family kept without liking the ancestor. The causeway narrowed men's choices and their boasts. The reeds stretched away, breathing quietly, their lungs full of frogs. A man stepped from the fog as if drawn by a story he had been told about the boy become king who would pass this way. He wore simple things that had been worn hard and carefully mended with pride. He was taller than a man expects a reed to be and smaller than his gaze suggested. "Your Grace," he said, "Howland Reed sends his son to welcome you to the place where a king should come humbly." "Jojen?" Robb asked, distracted for a moment by a hunger for names he had not allowed himself. The boy's mouth softened at the sound of that name. "Jojen is north," he said. "I am his cousin, Mira's brother, enough of such. I am called by a name I would not waste upon men who want to wear it as armor. You may call me Reed and trust that it will suffice. We have kept our little paths woven tight. The Ironborn have learned to fear what they do not control. They will learn more. Come and eat with us where bread is baked flat and patience is also a food." Robb nodded. The fellowship of a man who reads water like a book is a rare fellowship. They ate in a place where the fire noticed the distance between men and insisted upon warmth. They were given fish that had known the net and herbs that tasted like secrets told to a friend at midnight when the room is kind. The reeds rustled approval and the frogs contributed an opinion. At night, Robb slept with one arm across his chest and his hand upon the medallion Arian had given him because he believed in talismans and did not believe in them and found the contradiction pleasing. The North will forgive a man almost anything if he carries winter with respect. Robb rode through villages recovering from being plundered by men who sang the wrong songs. He stood a while at a place where a smokehouse had become a monument by mistake because a woman had stood in the door with a broom and defended her pigs, and he had to decide whether to admire or scold her. He chose to pay her for her bacon and tell her not to die for her pigs again. She chose to ignore that second instruction and he chose to let her keep it. This is how kings earn their sleep. In the yard at Winterfell, once a yard, once a home, once a casualty, he dismounted and listened to the way the stones made no sound. He listened to the way his own breath felt like a story being told to a child who didn't want to hear the ending. He put his palm to a wall and some part of him stood straighter. gray wind made a sound in his throat that was not a howl and not a bark, an old sound that meant a pack was missing and should be gathered by teeth. Ramsay had not expected him so soon. It is the habit of men who enjoy cruelty to imagine their enemies enjoying delays and explanations. He had left a man in a room with his fingernails laid out like motes of dust upon a tray because he liked the way arrangement made him feel in charge. He heard the riders and he smiled, thinking more. He went to the outer bailey with arrogance that did not yet know where to sit. He did not find more. He found men with faces like north wind and a boy no longer a boy wearing a wolf on a chain and a piece of sun against his throat. The first exchange will be for later. War does not need every scene to show its blood to be known in the throat. Robb did not demand surrender with a speech. He sent men around like thoughts that needed to cut a thing before anyone knew they were present. He placed women he had brought from the river to speak to women who had borne the insult of a bastard's contempt and who could be made to remember their own names. He placed men who had known Ramsay when Ramsay had been a boy who caught frogs and pulled their legs off to see whether they could hop. He placed kindness and shrewdness and a certain amount of necessary threat like chessmen upon a broken board. He stood in the middle of his father's house and decided to let the house tell him what would be wise to do. Letters traveled like winter birds then, sharp and few. Ariane's came with a drop of wax on the ribbon that had been pressed with the edge of a bit of Martell jewelry. She wrote about a lord's moot in the riverlands where M. and had gathered to talk about crops and had instead learned that a woman could make them want to plant properly. She wrote about Jason Mallister's joke about bells that had almost become wisdom. She wrote, "Your mother keeps a ledger of food and sins. She is crueler to the first and kinder to the second than any priest. Do not be afraid. She is not done with you. She is sharpening you." Oberyn's letters came folded into themselves and smelling of travel. He wrote of a hill where he had watched a Lannister company move with all the precision of a dance and had made 2 small changes in the roads to make the next such dance less graceful. He wrote of a baker who wore a red thread in her sleeve that meant she had lost a brother to a debt and had been paid in coin that made her hungry. He wrote of a boy who had tried to steal his purse and had ended up with a knife in his hand and a job. He wrote, lightly, about the mountain being annoyed, which meant he had begun to make mistakes. He wrote, "There are men in gold who have stopped sleeping well. You are welcome." Catelyn's letters were practical and tasted of ink and good judgment. She wrote the names of 3 men who needed paying and who would become enemies if forgotten. And she wrote the names of 2 midwives who had saved more lives than any lord. She wrote of the phrase. She always wrote of them in a tone that could have carved meat, and she said simply, "They will keep their knives awake. Sleep with your wolf." One night in Winterfell's ruins, the sky cleared and the stars were so numerous that a man could believe he had been forgiven for something he had done before he had learned what guilt was. Robb lay on a pallet and listened to the night work. The small scurry of mice who believed this house theirs now, the creak of ropes where men turned in sleep, the old memory of a gate that had once been opened and closed so many times it could do so in its sleep. And he felt, with that nervous peace that is the other side of fear, that he was not alone. He lifted his hand and his fingers found the copper medallion. He closed his fist upon it, and the little sun warmed against his palm, and the little wolf pressed against his skin. He slept. The days that followed were all work. Winterfell had to be made safe and then made a promise. Men had to be encouraged to speak and then to stop speaking. Women had to be heard. Letters had to be written to men who thought what they needed was to be flattered. Men had to be set along roads like good plants. Ramsay had to be found. It will be told another day what happened when the bastard of Bolton and the wolf boy turned king finally found themselves in a room that had known other arguments and other deaths. A few things happened first that mattered. A man from the rills came with a dried fish and a story about men on the coast who had begun to think the Ironborn might leave if the right songs were sung. Robb sent back a singer and a dozen spears. A woman from Barrowton came with a boy in her arms who coughed the way a man dies. He sent her to the half-maester who came now and then and this time stayed. A man in a leather apron told Robb to his face that he was not his father and then behaved as if he had married him. South of all this, in a room full of red fabric and loneliness, Cersei listened to counsel she did not intend to take and decided to do 2 foolish things and 1 clever one. She dismissed a man for reminding her to count. She hired a man for knowing how to stand where his face would be in her memory. She wrote a letter to Lord Walder Frey as if she did not know he was a man who read letters for the tone and not for the words. She asked for a favor without paying. She thought she had made a promise. Walder sucked his teeth and thought about the number of plates he had used at the last wedding and became bored. In the water gardens, Doran Martell smiled at a child who had put a crab down another child's back and then sighed as if sighing were a hobby he meant to pursue in a disciplined manner. He read the letter from his daughter and touched the edge of the paper with the same care he used when stroking the head of a sleeping child. He had a plan that had used to be about a Targaryen with more promise than sense. He had a plan that had used to be about patience as triumph. He let the plan breathe. He watched it turn in his hand like a small creature he intended to set down in the sand and told Areo Hoda, "We will go on as if our blood can be trusted to be clever. We will see if other people's blood can, too." In the Vale, it snowed a little along a ridge that did not need it. Sansa. She allowed herself the name in the privacy of misery. Sat with a girl who pretended to be her friend and learned to direct a laugh like a weapon without wishing to use it. She sang once, quietly, under her breath. It sounded like the wrong season pretending to be the right one and not quite succeeding. She imagined the river where she had grown used to the voices of men who loved her and despised her in equal measure. She did not know yet that the Red Wedding had not happened. She did not know yet that in one hall a mountain had failed to be a mountain for an hour. But hope is a secret animal. It grows fur in bad weather and lies down and breathes small, and even until someone puts a warm hand upon it and says, "Now." Robb set his men in Winterfell's towers with a pragmatism that offended the ghosts. He took a room that had not belonged to his father because he felt himself a thief otherwise. He walked the wall before bed and again before dawn because the act reminded him that rooms are for sleeping and walls for not sleeping. He ate with the men twice a week and scolded twice a week and listened 4 times. He wrote to Arianne each night as if the act could keep him from writing to the dead. He told her small things. A girl in the yard who had invented a toy out of a broken strap. The taste of the first stew anew. Cook made in a pot that had belonged to Maester Luwin. The way the ravens sometimes refused to leave on schedule and seemed to sulk like tired children. She wrote back and told him small things that made him feel the river's different laughter. A fight broken up in the kitchen by a cook who had won 2 battles in her life and had decided that a third would be fought with ladles. A child who had decided the Martell sun looked better if it had a tail. Brynden telling a joke about a trout that had outlived 6 generations of fishermen because it knew the stones better than they did. Oberyn's letter delivered by a boy who claimed to be a prince and was believed for 3 hours because he was so convinced of it that the lie became a possibility men enjoyed. She told him, always at the end, something serious, as if to mark the end of talk and the beginning of sleep. "Your mother is well." Or, "Your mother scolded me for being too kind to a man who will become a problem." Or, "Your mother asked me if I know how to pray when the god has the wrong face. I told her I know how to pretend." She approved. Roose Bolton answered a letter from his son, if a man can call what he does answering. He wrote, "Wait." He wrote, "Be moderate in cruelty. Men will think it tastes like justice and swallow more." He wrote, "I am with the king." He wrote, "The Martells are clever. Do not trust clever." He did not write, "The Freys are greedy. Trust that." Edmure wrote Robb once from Riverrun and once from a village he had visited because he had been told their mill had mended itself like a miracle. He wrote of Roslin's patience with men who called her Fry as if the word were a slander. And he wrote of his own impatience with a river that sometimes told him everything and sometimes sulked. He wrote, "I am learning to be married. This will make me a better lord or a worse one. I will let you know which." He wrote, "I caught a fish. It was too small. I put it back. I am practicing." When the first snow came soft and wrong and then melted immediately, men cursed at their boots and women at their laundry. When the second came, whiter and brittle, children had their day and men looked at the sky as if it had asked a foolish question. Robb felt his blood take the chill and make it something like a promise. He could not keep everyone alive. He could keep a shape to the winter that would not collapse in on itself. He went out with a small group one morning to speak with a village headman who had decided he preferred to pay nobody and be burned later. He returned with the headman's promise and with cold ears. On the way back, Gray Wind darted into the woods and returned with something like triumph in his mouth. He dropped it at Robb's feet. A strip of cloth torn from a cloak, Lannister red made ugly by being old. Robb crouched and touched it. He said nothing to the men. He tucked it into his belt and walked on. That night, before sleep, he thought of names he had not said aloud for weeks because saying them did not add wood to the fire. He thought of Bran and Rickon and the line of their mouths in laughter. He thought of Arya, who could not be dead because the world had not turned black. He thought of Sansa, and he had to put his hand to the wall because the word sister has weight. He thought of Jon, and he told the wall to keep the thought because thinking too long about brother in a cold room makes a man believe in loss too eagerly. He thought of his father, and the shape of the word father made him a boy for a moment, and he allowed the moment and then set it down. Then he thought of Arianne, and he smiled in the dark, and the smile made the room warmer. Not because she was a miracle, but because they had decided to be practical, and the very idea of a practical marriage becoming a refuge is its own miracle. In King's Landing, Tyrion read a gossip sheet and frowned. He suspected nothing and everything at once. It is the habit of men who live by seeing around corners to imagine enemies in every broom closet. He heard that the Riverlands were quieter than they should have been, and that Lannister foraging parties had begun to sleep badly. He heard that Dorne had remembered an old song and begun to hum. He drank a cup of wine with his eyes closed and tasted regret for a city that could be better and the certainty that he could not make it so while his sister wore a crown wrong. He wrote to Varys in a tone that said, "If you have news that smells like hope, cease perfuming it and hand it over." Varys wrote back in a voice that smiled while offering nothing that could be nailed to a door. He wrote that the North had begun to move in a way that was not mere walking, and that a wolf had married a son, and that the resulting weather had irritated men with lions. He wrote that the Vale remained a chamber pot kept on a high shelf. He wrote, "The river teaches men to bend and not break." He did not mention that he had paid 3 men to stop singing the Rains of Castamere in wine sinks. He preferred to keep available for other songs. Oberyn found the mountain again at dusk on a day when the sky had learned to wear bruises. He watched him from a low hill while a tree scratched the sky with branches that had never loved leaves. He did not go down. He waited. He had become a patient man in the way a man becomes a good chef, by burning many things and learning that heat must be watched. He sent 2 men at dawn to bleed a horse and take the map that would be written in the hoofprints. He smiled at his own restraint and then swore colorfully at a stone that had bruised his knee, because restraint should be balanced by honesty. At Riverrun, Arianne made a game of teaching a dozen boys to tie knots. Whoever tied the best was allowed to untie the worst. Brynden watched this and admitted, grudgingly, that she had found a way to make preparation into competition and thus get double the practice out of a day. Catelyn watched and said nothing. Later she took Arianne's hand and looked at her palm as if reading something written there in a script she alone could see. "You will have to be cruel soon," she said very low. "Crueler than you like. Choose the moment. Do not let it choose you." Arianne did not pull her hand back. "I know," she said. "My father has taught me a dozen ways to say no so that men do not hear yes. I will use 3 of them. The 4th will be a blade." Catelyn nodded and let her hand go. "Afterward, let someone see you weep. Not many. 1. It is easier to be cruel again if you have confessed it to a face that is not your own." "Who?" Arianne asked. Catelyn's mouth softened. "Me," she said. "I have experience." Before the deep winter came down like a sentence, they had 3 more victories and 2 failures that did not become disasters because men had been taught to retreat with dignity. In one of the victories, a group of Ironborn found themselves facing women who refused to be conquered properly and learned to be afraid of laughter that came with spears. In one of the failures, a ford took a horse everyone loved and a man nobody could describe without thinking first of his hands. Men drank that night quiet and stubborn and swore to outlive their sorrow. In the other victory, Robb stood on a bit of wall in a village that had been made ugly by hands and declared that the next man who took a woman's virtue for a song would die in the square and not be given to the river. It was a small decree. It saved 3 women that winter because men believed someone would see, and that belief kept their stupidity in their mouths instead of in their hands. He went to the Godswood again on a night that was more starlight than cloud. The face in the heart tree looked down as if it were his father pretending not to cry and failing. "I do not know if you hear," he said. "I do not know if you care. I think you would tell me to be colder. I am learning. Tell me when to stop." The leaves moved. He decided it meant not yet. He returned to his room where a letter from Arian waited. It spoke of a woman she had had to send away with coin and a warning because the woman had tried to sell her a maid's ear disguised as a sausage. It spoke of Bryndon's plan to make the Lannister supply road a parched throat. It spoke of the court she kept in Riverrun, a rough assembly of lords and ladies and people who had stolen their way into useful positions, and how she had begun to knit them into something like a garment that might be warm enough to wear. At the end she wrote, "I dreamt of the desert and of your snow, and in my dream they argued and then lay down together and were quiet because they were tired of pretending to be at war. When I woke, I decided to make men tired of pretending to be enemies when it did not suit my purposes. Come back having refused to die." He lay down with the letter upon his chest and the copper medallion warm in his palm. Gray wind curled at his feet and dreamed of rabbits who refused to be caught because they belonged to a story that wanted to keep its characters for later. The wind worked at the corners of Winterfell where mortar still considered whether to hold. A raven shifted on a beam and made a small sound like the hinge of a door. Somewhere far south a man sharpened his sword and sharpened his patience and thought of a girl in a tower long dead. Somewhere not as far, a woman poured tea and thought of her son's hands. Somewhere to the west, a man the size of a story slept badly and did not know why. The world turned once, twice, and did not fall. It held. And in the holding, there was space for what would come later to fit.